What if the world was collapsing under corruption? Not just governments or kingdoms, but the very soul of creation itself. Imagine a time when every heartbeat carried malice, when the thoughts of humankind leaned ceaselessly toward destruction. A world heavy with shadows, where innocence was rare and the cries of the righteous were drowned in a flood of wickedness. When we look around today, at broken trust, endless violence, and the greed that seems to seep into every corner of life, it feels strangely familiar. The weight of moral decline hangs over us like a storm waiting to break. But this story, ancient yet echoing through every generation, is not just about our age. It is about a time long ago when the earth itself trembled beneath the weight of sin, and judgment was written into the very waters of the deep. The flood was not only a downpour of rain, it was a cleansing of an earth overwhelmed by corruption. The tale carries more than simple destruction. It whispers of giants, of hidden rebellions, and of choices that drew heaven and earth into conflict. This was not a small chapter in history. It was one of the greatest turning points humanity ever faced. Close your eyes if you wish and picture it. The sky, once clear and blue, grows heavy with darkness. The ground trembles under the footsteps of beings too great, too strange to belong fully to man. The children of heaven, clothed in power not meant for the earth, had taken their place among mortals, and their legacy walked in towering forms, the giants, the Nephilim. Their presence twisted the natural order, and their rule brought suffering, cruelty, and endless bloodshed. The world was drowning long before the first raindrop fell. It was drowning in shadows. But shadows cannot last forever. A day comes when patience ends and judgment rises. That day was written in the storm, in the flood that swept across the alleys and mountains alike, erasing the pride of the mighty and silencing the roar of the giants. And yet, this story is not simply about wrath. It is about a thread of mercy woven carefully through devastation. For though the floodwaters rose to cover the earth, one family was set apart, a single ark carrying the fragile hope of tomorrow. In that quiet vessel, rocked upon endless seas, humanity's second beginning was cradled, fragile but unbroken. As we drift slowly into this tale, let your thoughts settle like calm waters. This is not just a story of ancient destruction, but of choices, consequences, and a creator who does not overlook injustice forever. It is about how the past bends toward the present, how shadows that once swallowed the world still whisper today. The judgment of the giants, the cleansing of the flood, and the survival of one chosen line, all of this forms a thread in a much greater tapestry. Tonight, you will hear it in full, as softly as a lullaby, and as steady as the rain that once fell for 40 days and 40 nights. Before we go deeper, I want to invite you, be part of this journey with me. Help me reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers, so more souls can hear these ancient stories told in a way that soothes and inspires. Share this video with a friend or with someone who longs for quiet reflection at night. And in the comments, tell me your name, your city, and the time you're watching this, so I can know where in the world this story is flowing. For those who want to read further, the links to the Book of Enoch and the complete 88 Books Ethiopian Bible are in the description below. These texts hold secrets and wisdom that shaped how the ancients understood creation, the flood, and the fate of the giants. Now let us drift gently into the heart of this tale, where rebellion met judgment, and where mercy floated quietly on the waters. They weren't supposed to stay here. Their location was in the boundless space above, where harmony flowed like an unending river, and light never dimmed. However, something inside of them shifted uneasily, a silent tug that pulled their eyes to the ground. From above, they observed its forests rippling in the wind, its valleys brimming with rivers, and the innocent stroll of humanity. These creatures below were viewed by the majority of heaven's host as frail beings stumbling through time like dust touched by breath. However, some of the watchers believed that humanity was more than just delicate. They were intriguing. As protectors who stood between realms and never ventured beyond the boundaries established by their creator, the watchers had been given the responsibility of keeping watch. They could lead but never descend. They could admire but not touch. However, what starts out as awe can develop into longing, and when longing matures, it becomes the responsibility of choice. One by one, as though a tether had been thrown to their hearts, their gazes shifted from heaven to the earth. At night, the children of men gathered near fires to sing and share bread. Their laughter ascended into the sky like smoke. As they listened, the watchers felt an odd sense of warmth rising within them. They witnessed the love between a husband and wife, the power of fathers tilling the land, and the elegance of mothers comforting their offspring. Nothing in the order of angels was like these earthly bonds, which were so obvious and unpolished. Though without the frailty of flesh, unity was flawless in heaven. Every touch and gesture had significance in this situation. The watchers continued to hover, dissatisfied with the distance in front of them. One of them spoke louder than the others, because he dared to give shape to the thoughts that the others only carried. His name was Wisp, erred in low tones. He talked about stepping over the line, entering the world of men, and abandoning their station for something that was both forbidden and alluring. Such words caused the heavens to tremble because they were born out of desire rather than obligation. His voice did not, however, become quiet. Instead, it warmed the hearts of those who listened for too long, growing like a flame that moved from hand to hand. Fire and thunder did not accompany the descent. Like a shadow growing longer at dusk, it was silent. They arrived subtly, dressed in forms that reflected the earth's suns rather than the splendor of their station. Footsteps used to traverse the soil of mountains and valleys while surrounded by stars. Once full of the pure winds of heaven, breath is now mixed with earthly air. It must have appeared to onlookers that the sky itself had lowered itself to the earth. Their first steps were cautious, almost respectful. They wandered through towns where voices rose in song, along rivers where children played, and through fields where men gathered their crops. Their presence carried a radiance that could not be completely concealed, and they were met with awe rather than suspicion everywhere they looked. They appeared to mortals as kings or sages, strangers with unfathomable strength and wisdom. It was not merely curiosity that roused the watchers. It was love, a connection that grew closer every second. The lines of human faces, the depth of human eyes, and the shuddering bravery of lives that lasted but a breath in comparison to eternity were all beautiful to them. Mankind's transient nature only added to their wonder, because the fragile becomes irresistible and the rare becomes precious. However, unchecked longing transforms into decision. The watchers never made it back to the sky. They stayed, gradually descending further into the world they were never supposed to inhabit. Silent admiration and distant observation were insufficient. They wanted to be a part of the lives of the people they were sent to mentor. They wanted to taste what eternity had never given them, to feel the weight of mortal love, and to hold the warmth of human hands. As a result, the connection between heaven and earth became twisted and unnatural. Among the daughters of the soil stood sons of the sky, and they bound themselves together in secret vows. The last line had been crossed by their fascination. What was once watching turned into dwelling, and what was once holy was tainted by desire. Humanity gave itself to them, and they gave themselves to humanity. At first, the world changed subtly, like ripples on a still pond. In the beginning, what the watchers had selected, love, devotion, and companionship, seemed harmless. But beneath it was a hole so deep that one day the earth itself would creak under its weight. The balance of creation would be thrown into chaos if the order of heaven were to be abandoned. What was sown in that union would not stay small. It would develop into something that would be too big for men to handle. Once clear night skies were now tinged with rumors of instability. The Watcher's presence was both amazing and unsettling to those who continued to hold fast to their moral principles. In their eyes, they saw a spark that was both dangerous and full of light, a power not intended for mortal soil. For most, however, awe triumphed over caution. Unaware of the seeds that had already been covertly sown, the people welcomed their guests. The Watchers themselves followed a path from which they were unable to veer. They were drawn further away from the heights where they once belonged with each step they took into the human world. Above them, heaven continued to shine, but it became farther away, as if obscured by clouds. They were no longer merely onlookers. They were over. It was a descent of souls rather than bodies. Fascination turned into longing. Desire evolved from longing, and unbridled desire turned into rebellion. By choosing earth over heaven, the Watchers started a narrative that would change the course of history. They saw beauty in people. However, in their desire, they failed to consider the consequences of entering an area where they were not welcome. Unaware of the burden they had brought with them, the earth accepted them. What their hearts had already decided was hidden by the silence of the night and the long shadows, far from the eyes of heaven, where they gathered. They conversed in low tones, each word bearing the weight of their intense desire. Their desire was more intense than their fear, even though they knew what they were planning was illegal. It was a hunger that had taken root and now demanded to be satisfied rather than a passing fad. They decided to bind themselves with an oath because crossing the line would mean risking everything. They pledged not to turn back, not to break the agreement, and not to desert the others when it came time to make a decision. One by one, their voices joined in agreement. This was a covenant made between creatures who had previously stood in the heavenly courts, not a simple vow. Beneath the silent stars was rebellion, wrapped in desire rather than war. Because they were afraid of being judged as well as of being embarrassed to stand by themselves, the Watchers vowed that no one would back down when the time came. Now that their oath was sealed, there was no turning back. There was a lot of silence on the night they decided to fully immerse themselves in men's lives. The earth was unaware of the breach that was developing over its rivers and fields. Lamps flickered and laughter floated from firesides in human dwellings. Outside those walls, however, the Watchers moved like shadows, their forms familiar yet strange, glowing yet hidden. They pursued men's daughters, attracted not only by their beauty, but also by the delicate strength in their features and the hint of mortality that made each heartbeat valuable. The daughters of men did not turn away as they gazed upon them. How were they able to? They had never experienced the presence of these strangers before. Their gaze was heavy with tenderness and mystery, and their words were gentle yet commanding. It felt like standing on the brink of eternity to be selected by such beings, as if time itself had stopped to observe. Their hearts should have been filled with fear, but fascination swept it away, leaving only awe. The Watchers were not conquerors. They arrived as lovers, promising unending devotion. Under the stars, they made promises that caused the night itself to sag in order to hear them. They gave themselves to the daughters of men, uniting heaven and earth in an unintended union, despite the fact that no altar was constructed and no ceremony was blessed. On earth, the whispered secret oaths had evolved into secret unions. Below, what was concealed above had been planted. They moved farther away from the order they were accustomed to with every step, vow, and embrace. They carried not just wives in their arms, but a mirror of everything they had given up. Heaven remained above them, but the more nights they spent in mortal homes, the fainter it became. Quietly, the world started to shift. Once guardians, the Watchers now taught things that were never intended for human hands. They disclosed the secrets of weapons, the arts of metalworking, the creation of ornaments, and the use of color to arouse desire. They imparted knowledge of strength to men's sons and knowledge of adornment to their daughters. Innocence started to erode like sand through fingers as what had been straightforward became complicated. However, the union itself lay beneath all of the knowledge, gifts, and teachings. Heaven and earth, spirit and flesh, and eternity and dust had all been mixed together by the Watchers. New life that was influenced by. Both worlds started to emerge from these prohibited unions. The offspring of this mingling were unlike any other. They were tall and powerful, their voices roaring across valleys, and their presence trembling men's hearts. Unaware of the magnitude of what had been born into its soil, the world gazed upon them in wonder. Once glowing angels, the Watchers were now fathers. They watched as their children grew into tall, fearsome beings. They felt a twinge of pride because they saw a legacy and an indelible mark in their children. The equilibrium of creation was changing beneath their feet, so pride and uneasiness coexisted. What they had secretly decided upon now walked freely on the planet, making it impossible to conceal. Once living in quiet simplicity, men's daughters now had to shoulder the burden of raising children too big for their arms. Their fields bowed under the weight of providing for these sons, and their homes strained under their presence. Something that had started out as love had grown into something that made the ground tremble. Nevertheless, the Watchers held fast to their unions despite the growing unease, unwilling to let go of what their hearts had demanded. Silent but sorrowful, the heavens watched. Because every secret oath was known above, and every act of rebellion reverberated for all eternity. The one who sees all could not be deceived by the Watchers' concealment of their descent from men. The weight of their union would eventually force them to face the consequences of their decision, which was woven into the very fabric of creation. Nevertheless, the Watchers continued to live in the delusion of peace for a while. They held their children, walked with their wives, and imparted beauty and war skills to humanity. Though the light of that world now seemed far away, almost like a dream fading with the dawn, they whispered at night of the heave, ends they had left behind. They had acquired what they wanted, but in doing so, they had forfeited something they would never get back. Thus, the world subtly entered a new era that was influenced by the Watchers' oath and the acceptance of men's daughters. Their union would not go unnoticed, and the weight of their legacy would soon be felt by the earth itself. Their voices were stronger and deeper than any infant should have, and their cries shook the walls of the homes where they were born. It was evident from their very first breath that they were not like the children of men. Their weight was heavier, their limbs were longer, and their eyes had a peculiar gleam that made people uneasy. Mothers held them in trembling arms, straining under babies too big for them. Fathers stared at them in wonder, not knowing whether to be happy or afraid of the life they had created. The gap only grew wider over the years. The Watchers' children and men's daughters grew at an unnatural rate. These children outgrew their fathers in a matter of years, whereas human sons might take several seasons to attain their father's height. Before their voices had even lost the softness of youth, their heads had almost touched the beams of their houses. Their laughter echoed like rolling thunder, their hunger seemed limitless, and their footsteps shook the earth. Because the giants ate enough food in one meal to sustain a household for days, food became a constant strain. Sheep flocks and goat herds soon diminished. Grain-filled storehouses seemed to have been swept away by moths. Mothers cried when they saw children who would never be content, and fathers strained harder than ever, but the land would not provide enough to satisfy these tall sons' hunger. They were both amazing and terrifying. All eyes were on them as they moved among men. With wide eyes, children peeked out from behind their mothers. As these imposing figures passed by, farmers paused their work to observe, standing in silent wonder. Since the world had never seen such creatures before, songs were sung of their might, but fear grew in the low murmurs around firesides. It was said that when their voices were raised in anger, they sent birds flying from the sky, and that their eyes carried a weight that could deprive even the most courageous man of courage. It appeared that the giants themselves were not aware of the fear they evoked. Life was easy for them. The world seemed to belong to them because they were superior to everyone else in terms of strength, speed, and size. With laughter resonating like storms, they engaged in games of wrestling that split the ground beneath their feet. Through the forests, they pursued animals, capturing with their bare hands what no hunter's trap could capture. There was a restless energy in their lives, as if their blood itself required continual movement. However, restlessness quickly gave way to conceit. Their sense of superiority was only strengthened by the fear in people's eyes and the awe of men. With their enormous hands, they started grabbing things without asking, including land, tools, and animals, as if they had the right to do so. Once welcoming villages now shuddered at their sight. They were still revered by some, who referred to them as gods or champions. Others silently prayed for peace to return and the earth to rise against them. The giants' appetite outgrew the soil's capacity to support them. Fields were left barren, rivers were depleted of fish, and herds were devoured. And when there was nothing left to please them, they looked elsewhere. They began by raiding nearby villages and forcibly stealing livestock and food. However, that was soon insufficient. Rumors circulated about gloomier appetites, blood-chilling feasts, and human not animal cries that were carried by the wind. The world that had astonished at their birth now shuddered in their wake. The earth moaned under the weight of their presence, and the balance of creation had been upset. Silence fell where they went, as if the ground itself had shrunk. Rivers slowed and trees bowed, the natural order eroding in the face of heaven's rebellion. Nevertheless, a strangeness that no one could identify persisted despite their strength. Despite their fierceness, there was a gleam in their eyes that was neither entirely human nor entirely angelic. Even though their voices were thunderous, they occasionally had heartbreaking tones, as if they were carrying echoes from another world. They served as a reminder of what happens when boundaries are crossed, combining fear and awe. Some of the Watchers proudly regarded their offspring as earthly kings who would eventually govern the entire universe. Others became anxious because they were unable to ignore the chaos their children brought. The oath they had taken now produced unmistakable fruit, and its roots grew stronger every day. Every harvest was overshadowed by the demands of mouths too big to feed, turning the once peaceful earth into a stage for unrest. Torn between fear and awe, the people muttered to one another. In an attempt to gain protection, some bowed before the giants and offered tribute. Others, too scared to speak out loud, secretly cursed their names. Even people who lived far from the giants' reach heard tales of their power, so no village was spared. Stories are powerful because they can transport memories and fear over great distances. The world felt smaller as the giants grew to their greatest size. Once endless forests were trampled underfoot. Their cries reverberated through the mountains. Oceans appeared to be merely impassable barriers. Nothing was insurmountable to the giants. Nothing was safe to man. The wonder that had greeted them was waning. It gave way to the weight of fear, a stillness that descended on houses and fields as their shadows moved by. The heavens were silent as the effects of rebellion reverberated throughout the earth, despite men's prayers for deliverance. The giants' birth was no longer merely a miracle. The earth trembled under the weight of it. Their once jolly laughter had turned into a sound that made men uneasy. The weight of corruption now made their footsteps, which had once been a sign of strength, tremble. Nevertheless, they kept expanding, rising higher and higher, as if their dominance was unchallenged and their hunger unsatisfied. With their breath trembling the air like a storm before it breaks and their shadows extending across valleys, they walked on the earth as though it were theirs alone. The size and strength of these towering children of heaven and earth initially astounded men and women. However, astonishment quickly gave way to fear because the Nephilim were not like other animals, constrained by boundaries and restrained by necessity. They appeared to have limitless reach and an insatiable appetite. They carried the burden of imbalance in their very existence because they were born of a forbidden bond. When they were young and strong, they directed their appetite toward the fields. In their hands, entire harvests that had once been intended to support families during hard seasons disappeared in a single meal. What used to nourish villages was reduced to a mere mouthful. Moments passed while the patient care of wheat, barley, and grapes, as well as the sweat of innumerable hours, were consumed. Overnight, farmers stood defenseless, their fields bare. As if sensing the pressure of their avarice, the ground moaned beneath their feet. Crops were not the only source of hunger. Before long, herds of cattle and flocks of sheep were pushed into these giants' mouths with the ease of a man reaching for bread. Animal screams reverberated over the hillsides before dying away as the animals were ingested whole. Families that had previously depended on their herds for survival now had to deal with broken fences and empty pens. With their eyes scanning the horizon for the approach of those massive figures, the people started to whisper in terror. Seeing beasts disappear into their imposing hands, unable to fight back, tired even the most courageous. However, the hunger remained unsatisfied and continued to grow every day. They could no longer be satisfied by crops. The number of livestock decreased until the pastures were empty. Their gaze shifted to humanity itself after everything familiar had been devoured. The giants started capturing men, women, and even children with a stoicism as cold as the silence before thunder. Once laughing villages grew quiet and hollow, their inhabitants dispersed or captured. What had started out as wonder at the sight of the powerful ones turned to fear because, at this point, no house was secure and no corner was sufficiently concealed. Under such cruelty, the earth itself seemed to scream. Where fields had once thrived, the soil was smeared with blood. The weight of grief caused the rivers, which had once been gentle and clear, to turn dark. When animals were hunted down and eaten, the once vibrant forests became silent, whispering through the branches like voices lamenting the loss of innocence. Even the wind appeared to be carrying laments. Under the weight of these imposing figures, humanity started to lose hope. However, the giants did more than just eat. They also trampled, ruined, and ruled over the weak as lords. Homes were ripped apart like delicate twigs in their hands, and villages that resisted were flattened. They tested their strength against wood, stone, and flesh, and they took great pride in it. The world appeared to become more chaotic with each violent act. When the Watchers first descended, the equilibrium between heaven and earth was upset, and with each heinous act of their children, that split grew wider. Though their voices wavered with uncertainty, mothers held their children close while muttering prayers into the night, knowing that their bows and spears were nothing in comparison to these creatures. Fathers stood watch at the boundaries of their houses. No wall was tall enough, no army was powerful enough, and no shelter was deep enough to keep them out. Hope seemed to vanish like mist before the dawn sun, and despair followed them wherever they went. However, humanity wasn't the only one who suffered. Their presence left scars on creation itself, mountains scarred by the weight of their feasts and battles, rivers rerouted, trees uprooted. Once meticulously maintained, the harmony of life now lay in ruins. The earth itself seemed to groan beneath their feet, as if she could no longer bear such a weight. As though all of creation was experiencing the same grief, the cries of the defenseless rose up and blended with the thunder of storms and the shaking of the earth. Silence could never arouse fear like their laughter did when it reverberated across valleys. It was the sound of unbridled power and boundless appetite. It sounded to those who heard it like the world itself was making fun of their frailty. A silent truth, however, started to emerge amid that fear. Corruption is temporary. As if some unseen hand were preparing a response to its children's cries, the world, despite being broken and bleeding, seemed to wait and endure. Nevertheless, the giant's shadow seemed to go on forever to people who lived in those times. The days were spent surviving, and the nights were spent in fear. Once created in the likeness of its creator, humanity now shuddered under the weight of its own tainted descendants. The giant's violence and hunger only grew worse as they ate everything in front of them, until the silence of the heavens was broken. The cries started out as faint, broken whispers that came from the tired throats of people who could no longer bear the burden of their anguish. Tears soaked into the soil as grieving mothers buried their faces in the ground. Once strong fathers bowed their heads in surrender, their voices quivering as they begged for forgiveness. The wailing of the few who were left was the only sound to break the silence of villages that had once resounded with song and laughter. As if creation itself carried their violence in its very bones, the ground itself seemed to hurt beneath the giant's footsteps. Birdsong no longer filled the forests. The creatures of the field fled deeper into hiding, their numbers dwindling, their cries faint. Rivers, once flowing clear and steady, grew dark and sluggish, carrying the stains of blood and ruin. It was as though the world itself had turned into a mirror of sorrow, reflecting the pain of mankind. Each broken home, each shattered life, added another note to the chorus of grief that rose into the heavens. It was not a single voice, but the voice of the earth itself, a sound too heavy to ignore. The angels who had not fallen watched in silence for a time, their hearts heavy as they beheld what had become of the world they had once seen crowned with beauty. These loyal messengers looked upon mankind with compassion, seeing the trembling of hearts, the breaking of families, the fear that pressed down upon every living soul. They saw the land scarred by the footsteps of giants, the seas groaning as though they, too, carried the weight of corruption. It was not only mankind who cried, it was all creation, yearning for relief. And so, the loyal ones lifted their gaze upward. They bore the cries of the people and the groaning of the earth into the courts of heaven. Their voices were filled with sorrow for what had been lost rather than accusations. They talked about the villages being destroyed by fire, the kids being abducted, and the animals being hunted until they were gone. They described the rivers that had stopped singing, the violently scarred mountains, and the stars that appeared to be silently watching a world fall apart. They made a heartfelt but hopeful plea that justice would be served. The sky listened. The voices of the devoted angels blended with the cries and prayers of humanity to create a sound that was unmatched. Although it wasn't loud, it was profound and had an unavoidable weight. It was the sound of creation itself, pleading with its creator for healing. The cries rose higher, not in rebellion, but in desperation for healing, and the very fabric of heaven seemed to tremble. A long silence fell, as if the universe as a whole held its breath. The angels waited for the Eternal's word while kneeling in awe. Their eyes were closed against the grief they had carried, their faces bowed, and their wings folded in silence. They believed that the Creator would not stop working despite the fact that they had witnessed rebellion among their own kind and that the children of heaven had wreaked havoc on the planet. The voice that broke the silence was like a river that never stops flowing, not like thunder or wind. It was the voice that summoned the stars into existence and spoke light into the dark. It was filled with justice and grief, with sadness for what had been lost and a determination to find a solution. Because it carried a weight that extended to the boundaries of creation, the faithful shuddered when they heard it. There was stirring judgment, but there was tenderness even in judgment. The Eternal's heart was neither deaf to the cries of the earth nor blind to human suffering. He looked at the shattered, the exhausted, the shaky, who held fast to their faith despite the shadows pressing down on them from all sides. In addition to calling forth the plan that would bring about both cleansing and renewal, his voice also spoke consolation into the heavens. As the devoted angels listened, they felt comforted by the knowledge that the world's suffering had not been forgotten. The word spread like fire on the messenger's wings. Heaven declared that the corruption would end. The end of the giants' dominion was coming, because they ate without mercy and drew blood carelessly. They would judge the fallen watchers, who had abandoned the beauty of heaven for the lust of earth. The time for silence was over. The cries of the defenseless, the blood of the dead, and the groaning of creation had all reached the throne. Because the people were still unaware of what the heavens had announced, the earth continued to tremble in its sorrow. For them, every night was a shadow of fear, and every day was just another struggle to survive. But hidden from their view, the faithful ones moved quickly, carrying heaven's response throughout creation. Above, the stars glowed dimly, as if they too held the key to the future. As a result, although the sadness persisted, there was a glimmer of hope. The heavens responded to the earth's cry, and everything in creation appeared to be bending forward in anticipation of the invisible word of judgment. Because even though humanity had cried out in sorrow, it wasn't in vain. He was a man who moved silently around the world, but his footsteps could be heard in the sky and on the ground. Enoch, sometimes referred to as Idris, was not a magnificent or powerful person. He was a man among men, planting, harvesting, caring for his family, and looking at the stars with the same eyes as everyone else. Nevertheless, there was a calmness within him that was different from the others. Enoch carried a light that was not exclusive to the earth, while others were consumed by the violence of their times and terrified of the giants. His heart had always been pulled upward, away from the cacophony of men, toward the soft voice that spoke in the stillness of the heavens. Enoch listened as the world continued to deteriorate and many people gave up or joined the corrupt. He heard the rivers murmuring against their banks, the wind rustling through the trees, and the night sky revealing its innumerable stars. He sensed the Creator's closeness during those tender moments, and the one who created everything gave his soul a place to rest. It was said that Enoch walked with God. This was a walk of spirit and heart rather than a walk of feet on the ground. His life gradually transformed into a dialogue with the Eternal, a pattern of prayer and listening, of putting himself in trust and getting wisdom in return. Because he lived close to heaven, Enoch stood in quiet clarity while others screamed in confusion. The obedient and vigilant angels gazed upon him in awe. They saw in this man a purity that was uncommon on earth, despite the fact that they were messengers of strength and flame. Despite not having wings, his heart beat faster than many of theirs. He lacked a crown and throne, but heaven's favor was draped over him like a garment. His life turned into a bridge because he was the conduit through which heaven and earth interacted in previously unimaginable ways. Enoch was selected to serve as a messenger between worlds during the times of sorrow, when human cries had become louder. This man of peace was summoned by the Eternal, whose word had already been heard. Mercy was remembered even though judgment was stirring. The anguish of heaven over the destruction of creation and the hope of salvation for those who remained steadfast in their faith could both be expressed together in Enoch. Enoch didn't talk loudly. His remarks lacked the arrogance of men vying for power and were not cloaked in force. Rather, his tone was serene, akin to a steady stream traversing arid terrain. His words brought a strange sense of comfort to those who heard them, serving as a reminder that the Creator had not abandoned the planet, even during times of fear. He spoke of promises that extended beyond the range of human vision, of things unseen, and of truths murmured in the silence. It seemed as if the light of heaven moved softly through him, and his presence alone brought peace. But in addition to providing consolation, Enoch's job was to convey the Eternal's warnings. He was given words that were too heavy for men to handle without shuddering. His eyes were heavy with sorrow, but his voice was calm as he spoke of the judgment to come. He didn't yell or threaten. Rather, he spoke the truth as someone who had glimpsed what was to come. The earth would be cleansed of its corruption, the giants would not stay forever, and the watchers would not break free from their bonds. Nevertheless, his message contained mercy. He exhorted people to change their hearts, to abandon the violence, and to look for the one who still heard the cries of the tired. He reminded them that even though the world was weighed down by shadows, those who sought the Eternal could find him nearby. There were some who believed, despite the fact that many people laughed and wrote of his statements as the ramblings of a dreamer. He provided these few with a peaceful haven, and the hope he held helped to steady their hearts. According to legend, Enoch saw visions that no other man had ever seen. He was carried beyond the veil to witness the secrets of the winds and waters, the courses of the stars, and the operations of heaven. In order for him to bear witness to the magnificence of the Creator and the orderliness of his creation, he was given knowledge, not for pride, but for faith. He gazed at the residences of the obedient angels, as well as the jails set up for the disobedient ones. His soul bowed in wonder as he saw the Eternal's throne, glowing and incomprehensible to the human tongue. He remained close to men despite these visions. Instead, they pulled him toward their suffering. He spoke with even more tenderness after returning from these revelations. He had a deeper understanding of heaven's anguish over the world's destruction and was certain that both mercy and judgment were imminent. Despite its gentleness, the weight of eternity was in his voice. His words flowed with the breath of the one who sent him, not with human wisdom. Sometimes, children would follow him because they were attracted to his serene demeanor. The elderly relied on his words as if they were a staff to help them get through their last days. People who were grieving sat close to him, and even though he didn't have any big answers, they were able to find solace in the quiet around him. Walking close to Enoch gave one the impression that perhaps a stronger force was still keeping watch over the world, as the giants' shadows could not reach that far. The fallen watchers gazed at him uneasily because they sensed the reflection of the very heaven they had abandoned in his presence. His words served as a reminder of the light they were no longer able to approach and the purity they had given up. The tall, ferocious giants did not comprehend him, but some of them flinched away from his stare, as if the weight of heaven were pressing down on them through his eyes. Even the powerful were unnerved by Enoch's peaceful demeanor, despite his lack of weapons. He thus turned into a sign as well as a voice. Even in a world dominated by darkness, his life demonstrated what it meant to walk with the Eternal. His silence itself spoke of God's closeness. His words carried the breath of heaven, and his footsteps paved the way for faith. Men saw in him that the Creator was not far away and that the earth's cries had not gone unheard. Enoch, a reminder that heaven and earth had not yet been split apart, shone softly even as the days grew darker. Like the stillness before a storm, the silence of heaven broke. The corruption of the watchers could no longer be concealed in the cries of the earth. After patiently waiting and allowing time for repentance, the Eternal now spoke in a voice that shook the earth and heavens. His decision was neither harsh nor abrupt. It was the unwavering, solemn justice of the One who sees everything and judges the hearts of men and angels alike. The watchers were no longer free to roam the earth. The command was heard by the obedient angels who had watched in sorrow as their brothers fell into the dark. These faithful people had not turned away from the Creator, and they were solemnly ready when the time came. Since no true servant of heaven takes pleasure in destruction, they were not eager for punishment. However, they were aware that if corruption continued unchecked, the earth would not be able to heal. The watchers who had sown the seeds of destruction had to deal with the consequences of their rebellion after the giants' violence tore through both the sky and the soil. They would be chained and bound in the abyss beneath the earth, a prison that was created by divine decree rather than by humans, the Eternal said. Their once bright forms, which had walked alongside men and inspired awe in them, would now be bound by darkness and kept apart from the light they had given up. Because the Eternal's word is unbreakable, and no amount of human or angelic strength could reverse his judgment, there was no way out of this predicament. The messenger, Enoch, had been selected to convey the warning. His face was composed, despite the weight of heaven pressing down on his lips as he stood in front of the fallen watchers. Even though he was standing in front of creatures who had once been clothed in light and had previously been in the courts of God, his voice remained unflinching. He informed them that their corruption had been exposed, their oaths recalled, and their actions measured. He reminded them of their children's violence, the misery they had caused to humanity, and the destruction they had caused to the planet. Judgment was set, and their time was over. Once arrogant, the Watchers were now stripped of their delusions. Once gazing at men with desire, their gazes now turned dreadfully upward. The heavens were silent as they begged for forgiveness. Even with their heartfelt apologies, their actions could not be reversed. They had abandoned the order of heaven, left their home, and brought many lives into misery in the process. No supplication could quell the cries that had erupted from all corners of creation or wash away the blood that had saturated the ground. The obedient angels came down to execute the command. They were silent, serious, and devoid of anger. Instead of striking in rage, they did so with the serene assurance that justice had been served. The power of heaven's command overcame the fallen ones, rendering their strength insignificant. Stronger than any force they had ever experienced, chains of unwavering light encircled them. Once bright, their wings now carried them down into the abyss. The opening of the prisons, gloomy locations set aside from the beginning for those who would desert their Creator, made the earth tremble. Silently, the Watchers were confined to the depths. There was neither rest nor forgetting in the abyss. It served as a reminder that no amount of authority or insider knowledge could defeat the Eternal's justice. It was a shadowed prison that was closed off to the outside world. Once walking among the stars, they now sat in chains, anticipating the day when everything would be judged. Their once dominant voices had become quiet, resonating only dimly in the rooms where they were imprisoned. It was a moment of solemn awe for the men and angels who watched. Even though there were still scars, the earth, which had been burdened by corruption, felt lighter now. Although the source of the giants' corruption had been silenced, they continued to roam and cast a shadow over the days. The world shuddered when it became clear that nothing escaped the Eternal's sight after the heavens had taken action. Nevertheless, there was no cruelty in this ruling either. The decree had been the result of both justice and grief, not just rage. The glory those angels once held and their beauty before they fell were not forgotten by the Creator. However, in their rebellion, they had opted for shadows over truth and chains over light. Since mercy had been rejected, justice was the only remaining option. People all over the world heard about their binding. Fearful of what might happen to even the powerful, some whispered about it. Others experienced an odd sense of relief, as if a heavy load had been removed. Because the Watchers, who had once seemed like wonder creatures, had also been terrifying characters who demanded allegiance and imparted secrets that made men's hearts ache. Despite the giants' continued destruction of the land, the earth felt a glimmer of peace as a result of their imprisonment. With their mission accomplished, the devoted angels went back to their positions. Nevertheless, they carried the grief of what had been lost with them. Once shining before the Eternal, these brothers were now bound beneath the earth. Their tale served as a reminder that freedom devoid of obedience is actually ruin. Their downfall served as a warning to future generations that even those closest to the throne could face judgment. More than anything, there was a heavy stillness in the silence that followed. The chains held their captives, the abyss held its prisoners, and the heavens once again looked down upon the cries of humanity. The Watchers had fallen, their power broken, their voices muffled. However, the earth had not yet been restored. The days of reckoning were not yet over. The giants were still walking, and the shadows were still there. The bodies of the great giants did not simply disappear into the ground when they fell. A mystery darker than their birth accompanied their demise. They had been born of both heaven and soil, a blending of the Watchers' rebellion and the daughters of men. Their voices were muffled by the sword, starvation, and the hand of God himself as their enormous bodies fell apart, blood soaking the ground. Something inside of them, however, did not stop when their flesh turned back to dust. Their spirits lingered, restless and unforgiving, the Risu. Result of an unnatural union. They found no real home in either heaven or earth because they were neither completely of either. Unseen but weighing heavily on the land, these itinerant spirits floated. Their movements now stirred the invisible air where their footsteps had previously shook the ground. Although their voices could no longer be heard in public, men could still hear their whispers. These were not like the shackled Watchers or the obedient spirits that ascended in peace. They turned into shadows that held on to the living, consuming fear and igniting unrest wherever they went. Their fate was explained to Enoch, who saw the heartbreaking reality in visions. Despite losing their power, the giant spirits would not entirely die. Rather, they would turn into a source of agony for humanity, wandering around without bodies and looking for rest but never finding it. Their initial hunger for food and meat evolved into a different kind of hunger. They were looking for homes, troublesome hearts, and cloudy minds. Because of their inherent corruption and resemblance to their father's violence, they were referred to as evil spirits. Strange disturbances were noticed by men. The sun would shine, but fields would wither. Through the night, children screamed with invisible horrors. Whispers tormented the ears of the lonesome, and dreams became shadows. The people felt the spirits pressing against their souls, even though they were invisible to the naked eye. Since angels brought light and purpose, these were not angels. These weren't men because men had clay bodies. They were shadows of beings that were never supposed to be there, in between incomplete and unnatural. Below them, the ground moaned. Because they were not welcomed by the soil or the sky, creation itself appeared to oppose their wandering. They lingered in barren areas, hovered over ruins, and looked for the broken and helpless. They themselves were never at peace, despite the fact that they were causing problems for humanity. They were restless. Since their birth was not pure, they were unable to ascend back to the heavens. The earth was unable to accept them because of their extreme corruption. Their presence turned into a curse, a wandering that would continue until the designated moment. These spirits gave rise to what later generations would refer to as demons or jinn, forces that were invisible but profoundly felt, spirits that tormented, tricked, and drew men into the dark. They brought with them the bitterness of devastation, the memories of violence, and the hunger pangs. They incited conflicts, spread lies, and took pleasure in terror. Their will to corrupt had not died, even though their bodies had. In this way, the Watchers' rebellion persisted, not through physical form, but rather through an uneasy spirit. In an attempt to use their invisible strength, some desperate men started calling on them. In an attempt to win favor from these itinerant shadows, they constructed altars and presented sacrifices. And they listened, despite the twisted spirits. They disseminated lies that drove men farther from the truth, taught charms and enchantments, and whispered secrets that were forbidden. Through the spirits of their children, the Watchers' teaching of hidden arts carried on, deceiving those who sought them out. But others had a great fear of them. They described haunted locations, caves where voices resounded despite the absence of men, and valleys where shadows lingered. For fear that the spirits might hear, they warned their kids not to go out by themselves or talk into the void. Even though the people had witnessed the fall of giants and the return of their bodies to dust, they were unable to shake the feeling that a part of them was still present. According to Enoch's visions, These spirits would continue to exist on earth until the last judgment. They would not climb, they would not roam. Wandering would be their torment, and humanity would be burdened by it. Their power would never return to its former level in flesh, but they would be permitted to test, trouble, and arouse fear. They would stay tethered to the ground, enemies without bodies, shadows without thrones. The populace thus learned to coexist with the invisible. They watched for whispers as they plowed their fields. They invoked the eternal in their prayer to protect them from what they were unable to see. The presence of these spirits was like a reminder of the rebellion, a shadow that lasted for generations, even though the obedient angels were still watching over. Even though the giants were no longer physically present, their legacy seemed more enduring than their imposing bodies. Their agitated souls had joined the unseen conflict between light and dark. The shadows sparked unrest where men sought tranquility. The spirits tried to smother faith with terror where it took root. Nevertheless, the Eternal imposed boundaries on them even while they were traveling. They couldn't rule, but they could cause trouble. They might mislead, but they couldn't stop God's plans. Many recalled the tale of the giant's fall during the quiet of the night, when the wind carried eerie whispers. They were aware that the Watchers' rebellion had persisted through their children's shadows rather than ending with chains in the abyss. It would be until the end of time when ultimate judgment would finally put an end to these restless spirits. Until then, humanity would have to contend with the giants' memory as well as the existence of their invisible descendants. Generations of people's lives were woven with the tale of their wandering. Children were cautioned by their parents. Elders whispered stories. To remind the populace of the invisible battle, prophets raised their voices. The restless spirits persisted in their wanderings throughout it all, never finding serenity and constantly looking for a place that would not take them in. They served as reminders of what happens when heaven's order is abandoned and were the remains of a broken union. The Eternal, who had already predetermined their demise, was constantly watching from above as their shadows pressed against people's hearts and stretched into every corner of the globe. Noah was born into a corrupt world where deceit and violence had crept into every aspect of human life. He stood out in this broken world, though not because of his physical prowess or wealth, but rather because of his quiet devotion to God. When his name was whispered among his people, it conveyed a sense of solace. Noah, the rest giver. Although the world around him was filled with bloodshed, and men were vying for the knowledge and desires that the fallen angels had left behind, Noah's life had a different beat. He led a simple life, gazing up at the sky and believing in the Eternal, even when it appeared that the way ahead was paved with darkness. There was something unique about him from the beginning. His grandfather, Methuselah, the son of Enoch, saw in him the fulfillment of a promise, and his father, Lamech, felt that this child was special. Noah was born into a family that had not been tainted by the Watchers' interactions with human daughters. Noah's ancestry remained intact, preserved in purity from Adam through Seth, and then through righteous men who chose to walk with God, while those around them had bloodlines tainted by unnatural unions. This was what the writings meant when they said that he was perfect in his generations. This did not mean that he was perfect in every way, but rather that his line was pure, his heritage was unadulterated, and his heart was oriented toward the Creator. The phrase had spiritual as well as physical connotations. Noah's family was immune to such unions during a period when angels had come to take wives for themselves and produce giants that ate the earth. His lineage was pure, unadulterated by the forbidden seed that had proliferated so extensively. This made him special as a man of righteousness and as a conduit for God's purposes. Because there was still hope for all of humanity in the preservation of Noah's line. Without this preservation, corruption might have engulfed humanity entirely, leaving nothing to rebuild. However, Noah's purity was evident in both his daily walk and his ancestry. He did not participate in the violent feasts of the giants, nor did he seek out the sorcery taught by the Watchers. Noah looked to prayer for wisdom, while others turned to charms and spells for power. In the peaceful fields, he erected altars to express gratitude for life's basic blessings, while others erected monuments to their own might. His life was characterized by humility, a readiness to obey rather than to give orders, and faith in the eternal rather than in his own strength. His humility set him apart from the arrogant men of his era, whose hands were blood-stained and whose eyes were darkened by greed. Noah's home turned into a tiny haven in the middle of a generation full of conceit and lust. Despite being barely mentioned in the documents, his wife walked with him in faith and shared in his devotion. Shem, Ham, and Japheth, his sons, followed in his footsteps and learned to respect the eternal, despite the corruption they saw around them. Raising a family in such a world was not an easy task. There was constant temptation, and humanity was greatly impacted by the fallen spirits. But like a lamp that flickered in a storm but remained unquenchable, Noah's family remained unwavering. Noah must have seemed strange, even stupid, to those around him. He didn't pursue the pleasures and fortune that other people did. He refused to worship the idols that were erected by malevolent spirits. He didn't attend the meetings where people shared their knowledge of hidden arts. Rather, he sought wisdom from the Creator, raised his children gently, and worked the land patiently. His righteousness was a constant flame that persisted even as the world around him grew darker. It was neither loud nor a show to impress others. Heaven did not overlook this faithfulness. Noah walked in communion with the Eternal, albeit in a different way, just as his predecessor Enoch had walked with God and been taken. Noah's walk was firmly grounded in the world, resisting the wave of corruption, while Enoch's was lifted above it. His job was to stay, to preserve, to endure, not to be taken away. A sliver of humanity would be saved through him, and the promise of life would endure because of his unwavering faith. The phrase, "perfect in his generations," also conveyed a sense of contrast. The generations of men had become corrupt around Noah. The knowledge that the giants had inherited from their fathers, the Watchers, had contaminated human culture with arrogance and magic, and the giants had flooded the planet with violence. Men rejected the natural order of creation, reveled in cruelty, and enjoyed bloodshed. Being pure was a big deal in those days. It was a symbol of Noah's steadfast decision to uphold morality, of protection, and of divine preservation. Although he led a quiet life, his actions were a silent critique of society. His presence demonstrated that even in the face of corruption, it was still possible to walk in obedience and maintain faithfulness. Heaven looked on in approval, despite the fact that many people made fun of him, disregarded him, or disregarded his example. Noah was viewed by the Eternal as a man who could carry the burden of a fresh start and as a conduit for mercy. As much of Noah's strength as his purity came from his humility. He did not aspire to glory or think of himself as great. He raised his family, tilled the land, and made modest sacrifices to God. Unlike the restless spirits of the giants, his heart was rooted in trust. His steps followed the steady call of obedience rather than the root of rebellion. Even though it seemed insignificant to humans, the Eternal valued this peaceful existence. Noah's story thus became a pivotal moment. His faith was so important because his life was not lived in a vacuum, but rather in the midst of increasing corruption. His family remained devoted, his heart remained modest, and his heritage remained unaltered. There was calm in his house, while the rest of the world roared with violence. His tale upheld the belief that light could persist even in the most dire circumstances which had been sown in Eden. The generations before him had witnessed Methuselah outlive all men, witnessed Enoch being carried into heaven, and sensed the imminence of judgment. However, it would be Noah who would give shape to the promise of survival. His life, characterized by faithfulness of heart and purity of generations, served as the cornerstone for the writing of a new chapter in human history. His purity was not just his own. It also served as a barrier to prevent the extinction of humanity as a whole. Noah kept walking with God, his steps steady, his faith unwavering, even as the shadows of judgment grew over the earth. His days were filled with devotion, while others' days were filled with violence. His generation remained pure, while the others around the world became corrupt. And the seed of humanity's future was protected in that purity, which was maintained by both tradition and faith, prepared to withstand the impending storm. The Eternal's voice reached Noah in a way that pierced the stillness of his soul, not through thunder or roaring fire. It was a straightforward yet powerful command. Corruption abounds on earth, and its demise is imminent. At the door now was the judgment that had been murmured for generations. However, Noah and his family would be protected during this impending storm. The directive was unambiguous. He was to construct an ark, a vessel that was fashioned according to a divine blueprint rather than human ingenuity. Both hope and burden were attached to this command because, although it offered protection, it also made clear the enormous amount of devastation that was going to fall upon the planet. Even though it seemed impossible, Noah listened with a steady heart. In order to prevent water from leaking through its seams, he was instructed to build the ark out of gopher wood, a sturdy and resilient timber, and to bind it with pitch both inside and out. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high were the exact measurements. In the silence of the order, it was almost possible to visualize it, a monstrous ship rising on arid terrain, bigger than anything his generation had ever seen, spanning the terrain like a mountain of wood. It was supposed to have 3 decks, a lower, middle, and upper deck, as well as a window to let in light and a single door on its side. As if the Eternal himself were sketching the design in Noah's mind, every little detail was meticulously provided. Without hesitation, Noah agreed. Years of silent faith had molded his trust, so doubt and hesitation did not trouble his heart. Noah measured his life by obedience, while others measured it by the fads of the day. He started gathering wood with his sons by his side, shaping and cutting beams, and using patient hands to secure them together. Strange and out of place in a world that had never seen such a structure, the sound of hammers striking reverberated across the fields. As the framework started to rise, neighbors arrived, initially intrigued. A ship constructed on dry land, far from any ocean, must have seemed ridiculous to them. They shook their heads and laughed at the sight, making fun of the elderly man who had predicted a flood that nobody thought would ever happen. The ark expanded as the days turned into years. Standing like a silent warning against the corruption of the age, its enormous frame started to dominate the horizon. Men would scoff as they passed, wondering if Noah intended to sail his enormous wooden mountain across the sky. Claiming that he had gone insane and that he had wasted his life on a dream that was whispered by unseen voices, they made fun of his faith. But Noah bore their giggling. Because he built out of obedience rather than imagination, their disdain did not shake his faith. Every nail hammered into the wood, every beam secured in position, was an act of faith, a silent prayer of devotion. Youngsters would point to the rising vessel while tugging at their father's sleeves. Tales of Noah's peculiar project started to circulate among the villages. Others asserted that he was attempting to call upon the gods using a wooden tower, while others said he was enchanted. Many people just laughed, viewing the ark as a source of amusement and a way to kill time. However, Noah didn't use arguments to support his claims. He just continued to work, his heart unwavering in his faith, and his eyes focused on the task at hand. The ark itself developed a personality of its own. It was taller than the tallest trees and longer than any house. Pitch was smeared thickly across the beams, sealing every crack, and the smell clung to the air. The decks were separated into stalls and rooms inside, ready to accommodate all types of creatures. As if the ship had already been touched by a light beyond this world, light filtered the small aperture near the top, creating soft beams on the wood. The ridicule became more scathing as the years went by. People started openly taunting Noah, challenging him to call forth his flood and asking when the waters would come. They viewed his diligent work as foolishness, a life wasted creating an unfulfilled dream. Noah, however, remained unmoved. He was aware that the faithfulness of the heart, not the approval of others, is the true test of obedience. Plank by plank, he proceeded until the ark was finished and loomed against the sky as a testament to trust. The rooms within were ready for the animals, but none had shown up yet. Noah continued to believe even though the troughs were empty and the stalls were empty. He was aware that he would bring the living things to fill it, just as the Eternal had given him the design. Noah's job was to get the ship ready, not to gather them. He stood out in a world that was eager for instant gratification and rewards because of his patience and unwavering obedience. Noah's sons must have occasionally felt the brunt of the derision. Young and powerful, Shem, Ham, and Japheth were made fun of by their peers for taking their father's peculiar route. However, they also put in a lot of work, forming the beams, moving the wood, and joining the planks. They were as devoted to their father as he was to God. As a household, they were united by the call of heaven rather than the cries of the masses. As a silent sermon, the ark stood. It did not raise its voice or argue, but its very existence indicated that judgment was imminent. It was merely a curiosity, a spectacle to be derided to the populace. However, it was a promise carved into wood, sealed with pitch, and based on trust that meant hope to Noah and his family. The certainty that the Eternal had not deserted humanity and that mercy was still being extended despite. The imminence of judgment was contained within its rising walls. Despite the long years of work and the constant jeering, Noah never gave up. The weight of the work caused his back to bend and his hands to become calloused, but his spirit remained unfazed. He was constructing for the future of all living things as well as for himself. He was building a sanctuary with every beam secured in place, a place where life would be preserved and where the earth's creatures and human seed would endure the purifying waters that would soon be revealed. When the ark was finally completed, it stood out among the fields like a giant, its decks resonating in silence, its darkened frame glistening with pitch. The world saw it as foolishness, the product of a man with delusions. For Noah, it was faith given shape and obedience made evident. Noah was aware that the earth showed no signs of the storm. The rivers flowed calmly and the skies remained clear. He had built the ark according to the Eternal's instructions after listening to him. The vessel stood ready, waiting for the day when the heavens would open and the deep would rise, and the certainty of the voice he had heard overshadowed the laughter of men. The first sound, a low rustle in the far brush, was so faint at first that it seemed as though the earth itself was stirring, but the morning air was still. When Noah looked up from the ark, he saw the shapes of creatures walking calmly and confidently, as if they were being led by an invisible hand on the horizon. Their eyes were steady, their direction unflinching, their steps leisurely. They arrived as though summoned by a voice too deep for man to hear, not in a state of untamed confusion or as beasts motivated by fear or hunger. They moved toward the large wooden vessel that was silently waiting, 2 by 2, in pairs of all kinds. The first to arrive were the birds, their wings gently sweeping the air. White feathered doves that resembled falling snow landed on the beams of the ark. Above, ravens flew in circles, their dark wings fluttering across the sky before settling on the railings. Quiet chirps from sparrows, swallows, and colorful finches filled the air, creating a gentle melody that was carried by the wind. Their fragile eyes glowed with a stillness unusual for their restless kind as they huddled around the open window and sat along the roof. Even the owls, which are night creatures, arrived silently and folded themselves neatly on the ledges of the ark as if they had been anticipating this call as well. Then the bigger animals arrived. Elephants lumbered forward from the east, their heavy feet digging deep into the ground as their trunks swayed like pendulums. Despite their enormous size, they moved with gentleness, as if they were aware of the sacredness of their voyage. Lions trailed behind, their golden coats shining in the sunlight, moving side by side without snarling or growling, their power held back by an invisible calm. Bears lumbered close, their dark, thick fur moving surprisingly softly. With their piercing eyes softened and their fangs concealed behind silent lips, wolves padded soundlessly. They were not at odds. Prey and predators walked side by side, bound by a command that subdued all of their primal urges. Cattle and oxen emerged from the fields, their hooves tapping the ground rhythmically, their horns curved like crescents. Goats easily climbed the slopes, leaping down toward the ark with agile grace, while sheep followed in flocks, their woolly bodies pressing together as they bleated softly. Camels plodded steadily, their shadows extending across the dust as they swayed, their long necks bending. Donkeys followed with silent eyes, heads lowered as though humbled by the task at hand, while horses trotted, their manes flowing like rivers of silk. The smaller animals also arrived, some scuttling low to the ground and others darting swiftly between the larger animals' legs. The red fur of the foxes shone in the light as they padded gently. The ears of the rabbits twitched at every sound as they hopped with soft bounds. Through the ark's crevices and nooks, mice and squirrels darted, their tails flicking, while snakes slithered with smooth coils, their tongues flickering but their movements calm. Frogs croaked as they slid along moist patches of earth. Scales gleaming, lizards clung to the sides of trees and rocks before scuttling toward the ship. The creatures of the marshes emerged from the waters, crocodiles moving with heavy grace, their jaws closed, their eyes unthreatening, turtles crawling slowly, their shells shining with dew. As they ascended the wooden ramp, ducks quacked softly and waddled in pairs. Swans flew over neighboring pools, then lifted into the air with their wings spread wide, making one full circle before gliding down onto the ark. As they moved in neat lines, geese honked and slapped their webbed feet on the ground. Each kind moved in accordance with a rhythm that was incomprehensible to humans, as though creation itself had awakened. The sounds of hooves and paws, wings and claws, rustling leaves, and pounding feathers filled the air. However, it was not a cacophony of noise. Rather, it merged into a melody, a subdued chorus of life coming together under the Eternal's guidance. As the animals ascended the ramp and filled the empty chambers of the ark with their bodies, Noah's sons gazed in wonder. Every stall that had been set up beforehand now had an occupant. As if to test their new home, the elephants positioned themselves in the largest enclosures, curling their trunks around beams. As if they had no thoughts of prey, the lions stretched across their resting spots and closed their eye. Peacefully, birds fluffed their feathers and chirped softly as they nested in rafters and alcoves. Every available space was occupied by the smaller creatures who hid in corners. Noah led them calmly and without the use of ropes or whips. The animals' motions matched his hand, as if they understood. His sons filled troughs with water and grain and spread hay and straw. The ark's steady, serene sound of chewing and drinking blended with the creak of the massive wooden structure as it supported the weight of its living cargo. Peacocks fanning their colorful tails as they strutted into place, kangaroos leaping lightly as if the wooden floor were a meadow, giraffes bending their long necks to peer curiously into the ark before ducking low to enter, zebras with striped coats that shimmered in the sun, and pairs of animals kept coming in pairs. Even the insects arrived in pairs, bees buzzing softly as they entered hives set up for them inside the ship, ants marching in tiny lines, and beetles crawling across the wood. Inside the ark, butterflies flitted in, their wings displaying floral hues, perched on beams like the petals of a living garden. The local populace assembled in disbelief at a distance. As they saw wolves strolling peacefully next to sheep, snakes gliding past birds without striking, and enormous creatures moving with grace, their laughter subsided. They did not change their minds despite their inability to explain it. They found it odd, even miraculous, but insufficient to inspire faith. Their eyes saw, but their hearts did not comprehend. The sounds inside the ark became more varied and complex, including the whisper of wings, the chirp of sparrows, the soft bleating of goats, and the low rumble of elephants. It was a chorus of creation assembled under one roof, a living symphony. The warmth of life filled the chambers as the aromas of wood, hay, and animals blended together. Even though the sky was still clear outside, there was a sense of anticipation inside the ark, as if the creatures themselves could sense the imminence of the storm. Among them, Noah and his family moved, providing steady hands, soft words, and soothing touches. Their eyes were fearless because they had faith in the hand that had created these creatures. No longer merely a building made of pitch and wood, the ark was alive, breathing and moving, a haven of all life ready to be preserved. From the highest rafters to the lowest stalls, they continued to arrive in pairs until the ship was bursting with life. No creature was overlooked or forgotten. They all found their place. They responded, moving cautiously into safety until the ark was filled with the entirety of creation, as if the Eternal had inscribed their names on the ground. The air was thick with disobedience beneath the splendor of the sun, which hung low in the sky and spilled gold across the landscape. Noah stood at the ark's gates, his voice steady but worn, echoing through the fields where men and women congregated, both inquisitive and derisive. For years, he had reminded them of what lay ahead with the same words, molded by hope and patience. He described an impending judgment, a flood that was unlike any storm they had ever experienced, and waters that would rise and purify the earth. Because he did not want to see them die, his voice trembled not out of fear, but out of compassion. However, their hearts had become as hard as stone, and their ears had become deaf. Their voices rose in a cruel chorus as they openly laughed at him. Behind him, they derided the massive ship, calling it a monument to insanity and to foolishness. Some clapped their hands in laughter at the sight of predators sleeping peacefully next to prey, while others pointed at the animals inside and shook their heads as though Noah had gone insane. Their pride prevented them from seeing the miracle in front of them. To them, the ark served as a stage for their mockery rather than a haven. With a wave off their hands, the people's elders dismissed him, saying that although the rivers had always flowed and the skies had always produced rain, the earth had never been engulfed by water. They smirked as they asked, "Do you think that the ground that sustains us will turn against us? That we will be drowned by the sky itself?" They said, "This man talks of shadows and dreams." The younger men listened eagerly and laughed as they yelled back at Noah, labeling him a doomsayer and a fool who had squandered his years in carpentry rather than celebrating. However, Noah did not become irate. Knowing that their mockery was directed not at him, but at the one who had addressed him, he just stood with the weight of his message bearing down on him. His face was wrinkled from years of begging with his people, and his hands were rough from the ark's labor, but that unwavering flame of faith remained in his eyes. Even as they jeered, he raised his head and muttered to the sky rather than to them, a plea that if they would just turn, they might still find mercy. The giants were among them, looming over the others and creating long shadows in the evening light. They were enormous, with shoulders as wide as trees, and everyone knew how strong they were. They had eaten the food of the land, the animals, and even people, taking whatever they wanted. Their lips curled into ruthless smiles as they regarded Noah with contempt rather than fear. With a thunderous voice, one of them made fun of Noah by posing the question, "Is the ark strong enough to hold me?" Others joined in, boasting that no sea could lift a ship loaded with such creatures, and that they would wade through the seas with steps taller than the waves if they did. Because they thought they were untouchable, their conceit was louder than men's laughter. They considered themselves to be half divine, indestructible, lords of the earth, the offspring of heaven's watchers and the women of men. Their pride had grown to fill the sky, and they had been feared by some and worshipped by others. Noah, however, watched them with dismay because he knew that the Eternal's word was far more powerful than their strength. He was also made fun of by the land's women, who shook their heads as they went by, decked out in decorations and colorful paintings. They questioned one another about whether Noah planned to create a market for meat and wool inside the ark, while laughing at the animals crammed inside. Children ran back with shrieks of laughter as the sound reverberated as they followed their mothers, throwing stones at the wooden walls of the ark. Their games turned into vicious mimicries of contempt as their innocence was suffused by their parents' corruption. Noah called again, even as the evening shadows grew longer. Despite the strain of years, his voice broke as he begged. He informed them of the Eternal's patience and the opportunity they still had to board the ark and be saved along with their loved ones. He informed them that the door was open, that it would not stay that way indefinitely, and that once it was closed, it would never be opened again. Despite the weight and fragility of his words, the people turned away. They muttered insults, shook their heads, and went back to feasting. With a roar of laughter, the giants boasted that they would rip the heavens apart before allowing the waters to carry them away. A few of them stomped their feet, claiming that it was not an invisible flood that was causing the ground to tremble beneath their feet. They shouted challenges to Noah, challenging him to prove his warnings, and clapped their great hands together. They saw his obedience as stupid and his faith as weakness. Daring the Eternal to do something, they raised their faces to the sky. Then, knowing that few would pay attention, Noah stood silently, giving his final warnings. His sons were quietly working around him, finishing up the ark's preparations. Their wives moved quietly, gathering food, setting up the creatures' spaces, and not saying much. Even though they were hurt by the mockery of the world, they carried their father's faith with them and understood the importance of what he had said. Behind them, the ark's massive door loomed, still open and welcoming to everyone who turned. However, no voices begged for pity, and no footsteps appeared. As night fell, the land was surrounded by silently burning stars. In the camps of men, fires broke out, laughter and feasting persisted, and the quiet cries of those who were still unsure whether Noah's words were true were muffled by songs of celebration. However, pride held them fast, and their inquiries were silenced out of fear of ridicule. While the people clung to their strength as if it could protect them, the giants lay back among them, their voices booming in stories of conquest and appetite. The animals slept in the ark, their eyes serene, their breaths slow. The ship stood, waiting, but heavy with life, and creaked softly. Noah entered, stopped at the doorway, and turned back to face the distant campfires. For years, his message and voice had reverberated throughout the country, but now he was met with silence. The door was still open, but the world would not come, so he turned his face toward the darkness, his heart aching with grief rather than rage. Unbelievably, the sky started to change. The air carried a weight that pressed against the skin as the morning rose in an odd silence. Heavy, swelling masses of clouds rolled together like a dark sea above, rather than the soft, ephemeral clouds that promised a quick shower. The sun's light faded as though it had been swallowed, and their hue intensified from gray to charcoal. But nobody seemed to care. They dismissed the uneasiness in the air and continued with their feasts and songs, their labor and their lau. Uter. Curious about the odd shapes of the clouds, children pointed at them, but adults told them to stop and play because storms always came and went. But Noah's eyes watched silently. His faith remained unwavering despite his heavy heart as he stood close to the ark. The door of the ship was still open, but no one outside had heard his final warnings. His family went inside, gathering the last of their belongings, and the animals shifted uneasily, as if they could sense the change before human eyes could. The ground was still dry, but a gentle wind carried the smell of moisture. With their leaves whispering against each other, the trees swayed slightly, as if they were whispering secrets that only they could hear. The first drop followed. Unnoticed by most, it fell silently, leaving a single dark spot on the earth's dust. Then came another, and another, scattering the ground like ink. As if to brush it off as a simple mist, Some men raised their eyes to the sky and wiped their brows, but the light grew dimmer and the clouds grew thicker. From above came a deep, distant rumble that was more like a vibration in the chest than in the ear. The giants laughed loudly and dismissed the storm as nothing more than the breath of nature, but the people looked up uneasily. More and more drops started to fall, soft at first, pattering on rooftops, tapping against leaves, and trickling down the bare shoulders of people standing in the open. Like the subtle rhythm of fingers on a drum, the sound was soft and almost calming. Children ran barefoot and danced in it, their laughter blending with the sound of the rain. Men held their hands up to the sky in jest, asking, "Is this the great flood Noah warned us of?" While women tugged garments over their heads and muttered about the inconvenience. "Wet our bread with a drizzle?" Their derision spread throughout the audience, bolstering their self-esteem and numbing the escalating apprehension. However, the sky remained cloudy. With their bellies swollen with water, the clouds pressed low, where and tightened. The air became heavy with a silence that hung between the drops as the light faded until the day seemed to be turning to dusk. Outside the ark, the animals shifted uneasily, some yanking at their tethers and others raising their noses as though they could smell danger. The wind shifted, bringing with it a coldness that was out of season. As the shadows grew deeper around them, the laughter subsided as the group paused and looked at one another. The drops became heavier and bigger, splattering softly on the ground. Where the earth drank rapidly, dust turned to mud, but soon tiny puddles formed, rippling with every new fall. A steady patter turned into a continuous hum that permeated the entire country. Fires sputtered in the open air, clothes were soaked and roofs dripped. While their parents reprimanded them for their mischievous behavior, the children who had previously laughed now screamed in play as they chased one another through the expanding puddles. Even then, not many people thought about what Noah had said. They shook their heads and declared that storms would pass again because they had already happened. Noah silently watched from the ark. In the waning light, his sons stood next to him, their faces pallid. They didn't say anything because the sound of the rain was enough to convey their message. Behind them, his daughters-in-law labored silently, gathering necessities, their eyes darting to the door but their movements steady. The bleating of sheep, the lowing of cattle, and the gentle growls of lions all blended into a chorus of unease as the animals became restless. The ark's wooden beams made a slight creaking sound, as though they were responding to the storm outside. The rain continued to fall, and the people, still unconvinced, grew impatient. Their hair became heavy, their clothing clung to their bodies, and their fires extinguished entirely. Muttering about the annoyance, they took cover under rooftops and trees. Raising their voices above the rain, some of them mocked louder, saying that Noah had wasted his life. "This is a soft judgment, if it is one," they mocked. Even as they were laughing, thunder erupted in the sky, a sudden roar that caused the ground to tremble beneath their feet. "We will drink the tears of the sky and call it wine." At that moment, the giants raised their eyes and narrowed them toward the sky. Their voices were low and uncertain as they muttered to one another. Their eyes showed a glimmer of doubt, but their pride prevented them from being afraid. Some assured themselves that they were immovable by pressing their large hands against the ground as though to feel its strength beneath them. But there was no longer any calm in the sky above. It swirled like an agitated ocean, its depths brimming with invisible strength. Within, forks of light flickered dimly, obscured by the cloud cover, and each flash was accompanied by a growl that rolled like distant war drums. It was raining steadily and relentlessly by nightfall. Where the ground had been dry, streams started to swell and trickles formed. Although their eyes frequently strayed to the ark, which stood motionless against the night, the people huddled in groups and assured one another that the storm would pass. A feeling of uneasiness crept into the hearts of some for the first time. However, they remained silent out of pride and a fear of acknowledging their mistakes. As long as their neighbors continued to make fun of them and the giants continued to roar confidently, they would not turn yet. The lamps inside the ark burned softly, illuminating the woe. Odin beams with a warm glow. As the rain drummed steadily against the roof above them, Noah's family huddled together. They didn't say much because they knew that the outside world hadn't paid attention. The animals moved, their eyes glinting in the faint light, their breathing steady and slow. The smell of wood, hay, and the slight musk of beasts filled the air, but beneath it all was the sound of the storm intensifying. The people continued to laugh despite the rain. They yelled at the sky, splashed in the puddles, and made fun of Noah from a distance. But above their laughter, the sky grew darker and the drops came down heavier and faster until the earth was drinking more than it could contain. They tried to ignore it, but a creeping uneasiness started to settle, soft but steady, like the first stirring of a shadow that could no longer be ignored. The night was long, filled with the endless rhythm of falling water. The sound of the world had become the steady rhythm of the rain, which had not stopped for a moment. Puddles turned into pools, pools into streams, and streams started to run wild as the earth, which had once been firm under human feet, softened under the constant pouring. Even though the rain was falling heavily, there were other forces at work on the land. Something stirred deep under the earth, where the waters of old had slept since the beginning. Long confined by the Creator's command, the deep fountains erupted. Waters roared upward from soil fissures, from secret caverns beneath mountains, from valleys and plains, to meet the rain that descended from above. Few people noticed the trickle at first. Springs that had previously provided a steady supply of water to parched fields started to swell beyond their typical capacity. As the force of the currents pushed outward, wells overflowed and rivers widened, their banks quivering. At first, the populace dismissed it as the storm nourishing the rivers, but the reality soon became too obvious to ignore. Water rushed upward like wild animals, tearing the earth apart with ferocious force as it erupted from the ground itself. Once harvesting land now drowned under rising floods, and streams became torrents. After laughing at the storm, both men and women fell silent. They gazed in amazement at the fissures that were forming in the fields, where endless gushing fountains poured. Waves of soil rushed faster than feet could run, breaking apart as they were swallowed. Unable to pull their animals away from the roaring waters, farmers left their animals behind. The first villages to experience the fear were those closest to rivers. What had been safe ground turned into a flowing current that carried lives, homes, and tools away. Cries rose above the thunder of the waters, wooden doors cracked, and rooftops disappeared under unexpected streams. Even though the giants were taller than men, they could feel the power of the rushing floods. First at the ankles, then at the knees, their firmly planted feet were swept. Even their formidable strength yielded to the power rising against them despite their best efforts to hold their ground. Their eyes showed uncertainty and fear they had never experienced before, but their voices carried pride even as they roared defiantly, some of them scaling trees and rocks. They were pulled down by the cold, heavy water that clung to their clothing. In addition to the constant chorus of rain pounding from above, the sound of rushing rivers filled the valleys. Clinging to children and baskets of food that soon became useless as the waters rose higher, people scrambled onto rooftops. Their voices were shrill with panic as they called to each other, but the roar drowned out what they had to say. Desperate to get to higher ground, some fled toward the mountains, but the waters followed them, churning quickly, transforming fields into seas, trees and sea. Tones were ripped loose and carried like driftwood. Roads disappeared. Water gushed from the earth's wounds, causing it to heave and break as if it were alive with rage. The deep fountains continued to flow. As though the very center of creation had been opened, they poured with unending force. Rivers overflowed their boundaries and became boundless bodies of water. Once vast beneath the feet of humans and animals, the land lost its shape as the flood rose, leaving it unfamiliar. Hills turned into tiny islands that were sucked up one by one, villages vanished, and forests sank beneath the currents. People held on to whatever they could, such as branches, beams, or the backs of animals, but the waters dragged them down into the depths with a ruthless hold. Noah's Ark held steady through it all. As the waters rose, it rose gently, anchored by God's hand rather than human strength. The animals shifted uneasily inside, their hoofs and claws resonating against the wood, but they were safe, their hearts quivering at the sounds of the cries they could just make out. Noah's family sat in silence as they listened to the thunder and the roar of the waters outside. The world around them drowned, but the ship held, rising steadily as the rain drummed above them and the fountains roared below. The people's fear grew outside. Noah was no longer the target of the jeering laughter. It was replaced by cries to heaven, frantic prayers, and screams. Fathers waded into the waters in search of higher ground, and mothers raised their children above their heads, but the floods rose mercilessly. Horses battled the currents, their eyes wide with fear, their legs flailing until they sank beneath the waves, and livestock roared as they were carried away. Even though the air was heavy with rain, birds attempted to escape into the sky, but their wings were heavy and their feathers were soaked until they fell into the rising waters as well. Now, some of the people who had made fun of Noah ran in the direction of the ark, pleading for admission with broken voices. They screamed for help as they clawed at its sealed door and banged against its side. However, God's hand, not Noah's, had closed the door. What had been sealed from above could not be opened by the cries outside. Inside, unable to block out the sound of desperation, Noah's family sat in silence with tears in their eyes. Knowing that judgment had arrived and that the world outside was vanishing into endless waters, they prayed in quiet, tremulous voices. The giants roared against the heavens as they waded through the floods, towering over the others. With their great hands digging into the stone, some attempted to scale the mountains in an attempt to get away from the rising sea. However, the waters trailed behind them, getting higher every second. Once feared by men, their strength was now worthless. They hit the waves, but their blows were absorbed by the water. Their voices shook the air as they screamed in anger, but even they were powerless against the torrents that descended from above and the fountains that erupted from below. Once so proud, confident in its power and corruption, the world now shuddered under the weight of water. Fields disappeared, towns vanished, and even the tallest trees bowed under the flow. Rivers rushed where none had previously flowed, valleys transformed into lakes in an instant, and the fountains poured endlessly. As the earth let go of the waters it had contained since the beginning, it appeared to be lamenting the lives it had sucked up in its tide. The sound of the people's fear became eerie. As voices were drowned one by one, the cries became wails, and the wails became silence. The water was heavier than they could handle, stronger than they could swim, and rising more quickly than they could climb. The flood that descended from the very depths of creation itself, not just from the sky, engulfed the entire planet, reducing the mighty to nothing and the proud to nothing. The world was being washed away as the fountains of the deep shattered open. The once familiar landscape had become unrecognizable due to the rising waters. An endless ocean engulfed the hills that had once gently rolled across the horizon. There were still mountains, but their summits were getting smaller in the face of the unrelenting flood. The giants known as the Nephilim, creatures born of the forbidden union between the Watchers of Heaven and the Daughters of Men, stood against this backdrop of unforgiving waters. They were imposing beings, powerful beyond the might of armies, feared by humans, and revered by some as deities. But now that the waters were rising higher, even they appeared insignificant in comparison to the flood's wrath. They waded through the rising seas, their enormous feet churning the currents. Like trees in a storm, they swung their arms, hitting the waves as if they could physically push them away. Although their roars were deep and strong, they were hollow and conveyed more desperation than defiance as they reverberated across the water. Once blazing with pride, their eyes now flickered with fear. They were confronted for the first time with an insurmountable foe, one that neither blade nor physical strength could defeat. With hands capable of tearing stones apart, some attempted to scale cliffsides. The muscles of their arms bulged with strain as their fingers dug into the damp rock, pulling their massive bodies upward. However, neither the rain nor the waters slowed. The flood followed the fountains of the deep still as they erupted from the ground. They climbed higher and higher, seeking cover on the peaks, their breath heavy with exhaustion, their wet hair plastered against their powerful shoulders. They had never experienced weakness or boundaries, and now every ascent served as a reminder that even their enormous size was powerless to override the decree. Others raised their faces to the sky while standing waist-deep in the water. They cursed the God who had judged them as they shook their fists at the storm-filled sky. Lightning flashed silver on their towering forms, revealing their twisted expressions of despair and rage, and thunder rolled in response. Their voices roared back, but there was no response. Just more rain and water pouring up into their mouths, necks, and chests. The waves swallowed their voices, and their roars became choking cries. Some engaged in wild combat, struggling against the currents and attempting to hold their ground as though the rising tide could be stopped by sheer willpower. In a last-ditch effort to save themselves, they tore down trees that floated like driftwood, trampled over houses that had already been buried, and lifted men and animals in their enormous hands. However, there was no more food, no dry land to live on, and no way out. As useless to their survival as the stones they held onto, the men and animals they captured either slipped away or died in their hands. They looked at the ark. As the world around it writhed in chaos, it appeared from a distance to be a mountain itself, rising steadily calmly upon the waters. With resentment and desire, some of the giants approached it, their steps resembling waves. They pounded against its sides with hands capable of crushing boulders. Their cries, pleading, threatening, and demanding entry, echoed loudly across the waters. However, it was the hand of heaven, not Noah's, that sealed the ark's door. Even in the face of the giant's wrath, the wood, which was stronger than mortal craft, refused to give. Their roars shook the air and their fists pounded, but the ship remained intact, carrying its chosen inside while the powerful outside died. Only the highest peaks were left, so the giants turned to the mountains. Their great bodies led together on narrow ridges that had once seemed laughably small beneath their height. They climbed in groups, pulling themselves upward with their hands and feet. As the waters closed in, those ridges were all they had left, their last hold. Deep voices rumbling like drums, trembling with defiance but hollow with dread, their roars reverberated across the sea of flood. Their faces turned white with a feeling they had never experienced before, helplessness. They gazed down at the rising waters and the remains of the world they had once controlled. Nevertheless, their struggle had a certain grandeur. They were enormous creatures, their shapes silhouetted against the storm-filled sky, their eyes burning with a determination to not give up, their muscles strained. The remaining members of a race that once thought it was unbeatable stood atop the cliffs like shattered monarchs. There was awe in the air at their presence, but their fate was certain. The heavenly decree was too strong for any of their might to oppose. They were strong, but not invincible. Despite their fierceness, they were not above the law. The water rose above their chests, waists, and knees. As though they could reach up and touch the clouds to pull themselves to safety, they raised their heads and extended their arms upward. Even the mountains themselves could not resist the flood. Some tore at the very tops of the mountains, shattering stones in their grasp. As they tumbled downward, the loosened rocks turned into weapons as the waters licked higher, consuming ridges. As the waves closed over their heads, the giants' roars were interrupted as they slipped and fell back into the sea with a crash. Under the rising tide, their powerful figures disappeared one by one. Their mouths were replaced by bubbles, their arms thrashed, and their voices resounded beneath the surface in muffled cries. A few brief I reappeared, gasping, struggling against the inevitable, their eyes ablaze with fear. However, they were pulled down once more by the weight of the waters into darker depths than they had ever experienced. After ruling over humans and consuming the earth, they were now engulfed by the sea. Those inside the ark who survived could hear faint echoes of their demise from a distance. Their cries echoed through the rain, blending with the thunder and becoming softer until they were lost in silence. Where the giants once walked, there was nothing but boundless water as the waves continued to roll over the mountains that had been there from the beginning. Their last battle was dreadful and heartbreaking. Their fate was predetermined from the beginning, despite their majestic size and fierce fighting style. All of their efforts, roaring against the storm, climbing mountains, and pounding on the ark, were in vain. The earth itself rose to administer judgment after the waters were commanded. The powerful Nephilim, who had wreaked havoc and corruption throughout the world, had vanished. The memory of their imposing shapes vanishing into the stillness of the waters was all that remained after what had appeared to be indestructible was carried away in the flood's unrelenting embrace. Though the waters were still wide and undisturbed, the storm that had raged with such ferocity started to lessen. There was a heavy stillness in the sky that had once been ripped apart by lightning and thunder. Like exhausted giants themselves, clouds floated, their bellies swollen and dark with rain that had stopped falling. The never-ending rain had stopped, but below lay an endless ocean. There was only water, deep, heavy, and silent, where cities, hills, and valleys had once been. The judgment drowned the earth that had moaned under corruption, and with it came an odd, eerie silence. Like a cradle in the tide's hands, the ark rocked gently as it floated across the face of this new world. The weight of life was supported by its enormous beams, which were sealed and bound tightly by the hand of heaven. Inside, exhausted from the long, stormy nights, the animals slept in their pens. They moved softly and breathed steadily, a chorus of life in a world of death. As if scared to break the stillness pressed against the wooden walls, Noah and his family walked through the chambers in silence, their voices low and their steps deliberate. There were no more voices outside. The giants' roars had subsided. There were no longer any human cries, sheep bleating, or bird songs. There was no wind to stir the water's surface. There were no angry waves crashing into the ark. Silence so great that it seemed to press against the heart engulfed the entire world. Inside the ark, every sound, the rustle of feathers, the creak of wood, the faint murmur of prayer, became amplified and reverberated softly in a universe that seemed to be devoid of all other sounds. Peace was not yet in the silence. Memory weighed it down. It contained the echoes of shouts from farmers in their fields, the rumble of giants tearing through valleys, the sound of tools hitting stone, and the laughter that once filled the streets. The memory of those sounds was all that was left after everything had been drowned under the water. The world seemed to hold its breath in silence, as though it had taken a deep breath and forgotten to release it. Under the dim light that filtered through the clouds, the water's surface shimmered faintly. The entire horizon became a gray and pale blue mirror as the sky's reflection wavered softly. The view was endless from the ark. There was only water everywhere one looked. There was no land, no tree, and no stone rising above. There was a strange and eerie silence in the horizon that encircled them like eternity, empty and unbroken. The silence grew more profound as the days went by. The animals in the ark fell into slumbering rhythms, their voices low, their presence subdued, as if they were also burdened by the silence outside. The family moved cautiously, spoke sparingly, and let their hearts ponder the enormity of what had happened. Noah frequently sat by the narrow openings, looking out over the waters with a faith-based patience. Even though he didn't say much, he was praying, communicating with the one who had saved them, and having faith that the same hand that had shut the ark would one day open it again. It was even quieter at night. The ark appeared to float between two heavens as the stars reappeared, strewn across the sky and reflecting their light onto the ocean below. Those nights were incredibly quiet, with the air thick with silence and the water hardly moving. What had once been a world of sound and motion was now just a ship and a sea. It seemed as if the very act of creation had stopped, awaiting the utterance of a fresh word or the resurgence of life's breath. There was wonder and fear in the eerie emptiness. Fear, as it served as a reminder of the severity of judgment and the speed at which life had been engulfed by water. Wonder, because there was a strange beauty in that emptiness, the beauty of a world that had been cleaned but had not yet been reborn. The quiet served as a teacher, reminding them that even the might of giants, noise and laughter, strength and conceit could all disappear in an instant. The Creator's will persisted, and that will, a presence devoid of words, filled the silence. Occasionally, there would be a brief pause in the silence. Small noises like an animal stirring in its stall or a bird's wing flapping inside the ark would reverberate like melodies. There was a reminder that life still existed in the gentle sound of the water tumbling against the whook. Beyond those faint notes, however, there was silence. It was the silence of an empty stage where the actors had left and only the still air remained, rather than the silence of peace following a song. The weight of this world would weigh heavily on Noah's sons as they looked at one another. Even that noise had given them the impression that the earth was alive, even though they had grown up surrounded by the violence of giants and men and in the middle of corruption. Their voices were the only remaining human sounds, and they were the only ones now. As soft as lullabies, their wives' voices drifted through the timber halls as they whispered to one another, occasionally humming to calm the animals. Even though they were tiny, these sounds were priceless because they demonstrated that life had not entirely ended and that everything had not been engulfed by the silence. A strange rocking rhythm calmed the restless hearts inside the drifting ark. An atmosphere unlike any they had ever experienced was created by the blending of the soft sounds inside and the silence outside. They were carried through a deathly silence towards something that was not yet visible, as though the ark were more than just a ship. It was a cocoon. Even though the silence seemed to be the end, it wasn't. It was the pause between devastation and rebirth, the breath held before the exhale. With the same stillness enveloping them, the days turned into nights and the nights into days. The waters never receded, the horizon never shifted, and the silence never ended. Hope, however, flickered in that silence, silent but unwavering. Because even though the world appeared to have drowned and been forgotten, the ark continued to float, propelled by invisible hands. Although there was a great deal of silence, it was not meaningless. It was full of assurances that judgment would not last forever, that life could return from a state of inertia, and that God's breath would be heard even in the most silent world. The rain continued. Day after day, night after night, it fell with an unending persistence until the ark's heartbeat was accompanied by the rhythm of the drops. Even though each drop was tiny, it joined innumerable others to pour in uninterrupted streams onto the earth. The sky appeared to be devoid of light, with only gray clouds pressing down on the earth. Instead of making violent cracks, thunder now rolled like far-off echoes before vanishing into the never-ending patter of rain. The heavens wept unrelentingly for 40 days and 40 nights, and the deep waters joined them, swelling until the earth below vanished. Time was hazy inside the ark. Nights turned into days, and days into nights, but they both had the same appearance. The horizon was obscured by the gray curtain of rain that covered the windows. The family's work was dictated by the rhythm of tending to the creatures entrusted to their care, and they arose and slept by the soft light of lamps. With their voices muffled by the loud drumming of rain on the roof, the animals moved, stirred, and settled. It was a continuous sound, harsh at times, soft at others, but never quiet. It seemed as if the sky itself had turned into a river that was gushing down, and the ark was floating like a leaf on invisible currents in the middle of that torrent. Darkness appeared to settle in the heart as well as the sky. It was a darkness of stretched patience rather than one of hopelessness. Knowing what was beneath the waters made Noah and his family's hearts heavy as they waited every day. In the middle of the storm, their words rose like incense as they prayed in silence. In particular, Noah was constantly drawn to kneeling in prayer during the quiet times between caring for the animals. Because he had faith in the one who had spoken before the rains started, his prayers were consistent rather than frantic. He still felt the burden of waiting, though. Faith necessitated endurance, and endurance necessitated trust that remained unwavering even in the face of unchanging external circumstances. The hardest times were at night. As the ark became quiet and the lamps were turned down, the sound of the rain seemed to reverberate throughout the entire space. Every person in the ark found their thoughts brought back to the past by that unceasing sound. They recalled the cries of children playing, the clamor of marketplaces, and the laughter of those who had ridiculed Noah's warning. The rain had taken the place of those voices. The family spoke softly to each other in the dark, reminding themselves that a new earth was waiting for them after these stormy days. However, they frequently spoke briefly because it seemed more appropriate to remain silent in the face of such vastness. At times, the animals themselves became agitated. In their pens, the lions paced, their tails twitching as if they missed the land they used to control. Wings brushed the walls as birds flitted in the gloom. With a sense that the world outside was different, even the tiniest creatures, such as mice, insects, and crawling things, stirred with an uneasiness. Moving among them, Noah and his sons provided food, comforted with soft words, and calmed with silent strength. Even the smallest task became a part of the long endurance of faith and the waiting. As invisible currents pushed against it, the ark swayed with the rising waters, tilting sharply at times and gently at others. With each step, the family's balance steadied as they learned to walk carefully. The strain of bearing life through the storm caused the wood to creak, not because it was weak. The groans and creaks became familiar to those inside, almost like the ship's breath. It served as a reminder that they were not lost by accident, but rather were part of the Creator's plan, which was why the ark had been built to last to this day. Noah's voice was steady and low, his words straightforward but full of faith, and his prayers frequently continued into the night. He prayed for the protection of those inside, the promise of a world after the flood, the fortitude to wait, and the endurance to be patient. Sometimes his steady voice lifted his family's spirits as they listened in silence. They were reassured that they were remembered in those prayers. Even though the rain had not stopped, the waters had not subsided, and the days were long and identical, they were nonetheless carried by invisible hands. The rain transcended the weather and became a constant companion. Every hour was filled with its voice, and every breath was measured by its rhythm. It would occasionally fall gently, like a lullaby, luring them to sleep, a whisper against the ark. At other times it pounded violently, as if the sky were fracturing. Regardless of its intensity, it was constant, and the family discovered the depth of patience in that constant cadence. They were powerless to alter the storm or speed its passage. All they could do was wait, believing that the same God who had summoned them into the ark would do so once more. Even as young children, Noah's sons frequently questioned when the rain would stop. In a kind response, their mothers reminded them that the same person who sent the flood would send the sun again. Like a candle in the dark, these assurances offered hope. Even though the kids occasionally became agitated, their laughter could occasionally be heard inside the ark, a cheerful sound in the middle of the rain. The family was reminded by those times that there was still joy in life, even when there was silence and waiting. The rain persisted, the lamps burned, the animals were fed, and the prayers rose day after day. By counting the days and noting the nights, the family did their best to record the passage of time. They woke up to the same sound every morning and fell asleep to it again every evening. However, a growing awareness that they were being shaped was present within the sameness. Their faith was growing, their endurance was being reinforced, and their patience was being forged. What had started out as survival was evolving into something more. In addition to purifying the land, the flood was preparing their hearts for the burden of starting over. 40 days and 40 nights seemed to go on forever, but they went by slowly. With every drop serving as a reminder of judgment and every waiting moment as a reminder of mercy, the unending rhythm of the rain came to represent their level of trust. And despite the deep waters and the still heavy sky, the ark remained motionless, supported by the pre-storm promise and propelled by faith through the pitch blackness of unending rain. With each day that went by, the water level increased until the flood engulfed the world's familiar forms. Initially, valleys vanished, their rivers combining into a single, endless expanse. Villages that had once been tucked away in lush fields were now obscured by sweeping waves, their homes vanishing into quiet, their voices lost. Once teeming with bird sounds and the rustle of wind in branches, forests sagged under the flow and disappeared, their crowns engulfed by the rising tide. Under layers of water that reflected only the gray sky above, what had once been green and alive turned into a shadowed memory. The flood moved with a steady, seemingly unwavering persistence, rather than just rushing with violent chaos. All that remained of the hills was the smooth, limitless surface of the water. Even the tall, unmovable mountains that were supposed to be the Earth's final protectors gave way as the flood rose, wave by wave, until its peaks became smaller and smaller until they vanished completely. Under the weight of heaven's judgment, the entire Earth turned into a single, enormous sea with no shores or boundaries. Silence fell over cities that had once glowed with torches and lamps, humming with voices and laughter. Under shifting currents, marketplaces were concealed, their stones buried in the silence of the deep. Under the water's surface, the magnificent homes that men had proudly constructed, skillfully carved and embellished with treasures were nothing more than shadows. Walls collapsed, towers fell, and everything that had been created by humans vanished into silence. The people and their memories seemed to have been washed away by the flood, leaving only the boundless expanse of water. There was no sign of the animals that had wandered freely outside the ark. In the early days of the flood, their cries had been heard, but as the earth was overtaken by the waters, their voices grew quiet. The herds that grazed on the fields, the flocks that dotted the hillsides, and the untamed animals that once stalked the forests were all gone. They had nowhere to go and nowhere to put their feet after the flood. Only the steady lap of waves and the whisper of wind remained in the air that once carried their sounds. From above, the world seemed to be one big mirror of the sky, gray on gray, with no distinction. Dimmed to a pale glow that seemed to dissolve into the waters. The sun struggled to break through the dense clouds. Day arrived without brightness, just a faint glow that provided no warmth, and night arrived without stars because the heavens were obscured. Time itself seemed to be engulfed, as if the entire world were suspended in a silent, water-themed dream. The flood did not rage violently all the time. Sometimes it lay quietly, flat and motionless, a never-ending sheet of glass that reflected the cloud shadows. At other times, winds bearing the aroma of the deep stirred the waves as they rolled across its surface, with its sides damp with spray and its wooden frame creaky. Nong. The ark floated on these waters. The outside world appeared unreal to those inside, a vast void with no end, where the recollection of the land seemed like a faraway tale. The remains of the earth were hidden beneath the waters. Silence shrouded fields that had once been ablaze with harvest. Stone idols and temples lay helpless and cold, unable to withstand the flood that engulfed them. Broken and uprooted trees floated beneath the surface like shadowy forms carried by invisible currents. Under the influence of the waters, the proud creations of men, their cities and their monuments became as brittle as dust. The flood did not distinguish between the lofty habitations of kings and the modest homes of farmers, nor did it distinguish between the great and the small. Under the sea of judgment, everyone was covered and treated equally. The last to give way were the mountains, those old earthly pillars. For a while their summits stood alone and bleak above the flood like islands. The waters continued to flow while men scrambled up their slopes in despair and birds clung to their crags. The peaks receded, wave by wave, until they were ingested and nothing was left. The same waters that had swept the valleys away also swept away the tallest ridges, the proudest summits. The earth was concealed beneath a garment of deep waters, and the world was leveled. To Noah and his family, peering through the small window of the ark, the sight was both awe-inspiring and haunting. They saw a world that had changed, with the horizon extending into an endless sea and the familiar landmarks no longer there. Only the faint clatter of water on wood and the low scream of a bird inside could be heard, along with no voices or laughter. Under the flood, the earth appeared to be sleeping, enveloped in silence, its breath stilled. There was an odd serenity about the flood. Even though it was the mark of judgment, there was also a great silence, a pause in the world's history. The corruption that had previously caused chaos and bloodshed had vanished. All that was left was silence, open and undisturbed, as if the very creation had been silenced. The quiet was both heavy and serene, the kind that follows a storm, though in this case the storm persisted in the never-ending rain and unending waters. Since there was no earth to walk on, no creature moved on it. The forests were drowned, so no tree swayed. The fields were hidden far below, so there was no wind rustling through them. Once teeming with life's bustle, the world was now motionless. On the surface, only the ark moved, faithful and steady, bearing the seed of everything that lay ahead. The promise of what would be and the memory of what had been, preserved above the flooded and vast silence, floated in that vessel. The earth had been defeated by the waters, but the promise had not been defeated. Even though the world was submerged under the flood and both valleys and mountains were engulfed, the ark continued to float. Life survived on that never-ending sea of judgment, kept alive by the hand of the one who spoke before the waters rose, not by accident. Indeed, the world was submerged, but in the stillness of the flood, a glimmer of hope lingered, anticipating the moment when the waters would at last start to subside. After the long, rainy days were over and the ark was still floating on the boundless seas, Noah looked out into the distance, looking for any indication that the time of judgment was almost over. There was a stirring inside of him, a silent hope that somewhere beneath the flood, the earth was waiting to breathe again, even though the waters still stretched out in all directions, unbroken and vast. Noah knew it was time to test the world, to see if dry land had started to wake up from its drowning sleep, even though the ark floated softly and creaked in the silence. He grabbed a dark, powerful winged raven, a bird used to living in the wild and thriving in barren environments. With a piercing cry that pierced the silence, the raven soared into the gray sky as Noah let it go. Black against the white clouds, it circled above the ark, its wings spread wide. It wheeled in the air for a while before gliding out over the waters in search of a place to rest. However, there was no land to greet it, and the world remained a sea. The raven's cry reverberated as if it lamented the emptiness below, and it flew back and forth restlessly, unwilling to settle. In the ark, the days passed slowly, each one characterized by the rhythm of waiting in faith, feeding the animals, and listening to the water's steady lap against the wood. A few days later, Noah looked up at the sky once more. This time, he picked up a dove, its feathers white against his grizzled hands, gentle and pure. In contrast to the raven, the dove was a peaceful bird that sought out the shade of trees and the silence of branches. The dove rose with gentle wings when Noah let it go, circled once, and then glided out over the waters. Its movements were quiet, almost tentative, as though it recognized the oddness of a world devoid of fields and trees. There was nowhere for the dove to land, so it flew low over the waters in search of one. Weary, it made its way back to the ark, and Noah extended his hand to pull it back in. Noah's heart was both heavy and full of hope as the little bird nestled into safety once more. He was hopeful because he knew it must happen soon, but he was also heavy because the world was not yet ready. The dove would be the first to notice the signs of the promise that the same God who had commanded the flood would also command its end. Noah made another attempt 7 days later. With a prayerful silence in his heart, he picked up the dove and carried it to the window. The bird's wings stirred the silence above the water as it rose into the air and glided out again. It traveled farther and flew with greater purpose this time. As the ark sailed by itself across the vast ocean, Noah's breath remained steady as he looked up at the sky for the bird's return. After several hours, the sun disappeared behind the cloud cover. Finally, the flutter of wings appeared. A tiny, delicate branch that had been plucked from an olive tree that had withstood the wrath of the flood was in the dove's beak when it returned. Noah's gaze landed on the branch as he extended his hand and grasped the dove. It was the most hopeful sign the earth had seen since the rising of the waters, despite its simplicity, small size, and fragility. It indicated that life had survived. The land had started to show through somewhere below the surface, and trees had woken up again to spread their branches and roots toward the light. Because of God's mercy, the creation seed had survived the flood. With its tender leaves and vibrant hues, the olive branch hinted at a future covenant, peace, and renewal. Noah's family must have gathered inside the ark, staring at the small branch with wide eyes. They had known nothing but silence and water for so long, the boundless horizon of judgment. They now witnessed the world's rebirth for the first time in this frail symbol. Joy stirred in their hearts, tired from waiting, as if creation itself had released a long breath it had been holding since the start of the flood. The animals also appeared to sense the shift, their sounds becoming softer in rhythm. 7 more days passed before Noah sent the dove out again. When he let it go this time, the bird did not come back. On the earth that was rising again, T had discovered a home, a place to rest among tree branches. Even though the ark continued to float, Noah was now certain that the end was in sight. The world, which had been engulfed in silence, was getting ready to embrace life again. The long hidden mountains and valleys were starting to show their forms beneath the sky as the waters receded. More than a mere recollection, the image of the raven and the dove persisted. The raven, restless and unforgiving, represented the severity of judgment as it walked over an unhealed world. The gentle and devoted dove bore the promise of life restored and the symbol of peace. Together, they conveyed a message greater than themselves, that mercy persisted even during the time of judgment and that there would be rebirth even after the deluge. The olive branch transformed from a piece of greenery to more than that when it was carried in the dove's beak. It was a gift of comfort, evidence that God's plan had resulted in restoration rather than devastation. It assured Noah that the world would return to light and not stay in darkness. Future generations would look back on this moment, seeing in the dove and its branch a symbol of life after death, of peace after storms, and of hope. Noah must have recalled the garden from which humanity had originally been exiled, where trees once produced fruit in accordance with the will of heaven, as he held the little branch in his hands. Although a lot had been destroyed by the flood, that branch held the hope for a new beginning and a world where God would once again be in charge of creation. This promise, that life would rise again, rooted in peace, carried in the wings of a dove, was carried by the ark, which rocked gently on the waters along with the remains of humanity and earth's creatures. The ark floated on waters that no longer roared with the untamed power they once possessed, and the days that followed the dove's last flight went by in a calm rhythm. The unending sea that had engulfed the world was starting to change, the storms had subsided, and the skies were soft with subdued light. When Noah would stand at the small window and look out, he would first feel the lowering of the waters with his heart rather than his eyes. Once limitless, the horizon now suggested shapes waking beneath the waves, as though creation itself were getting ready to rise once more. There was a faint change in the atmosphere. At first, the waterline dropped almost imperceptibly, but the ark appeared to sink farther into a new calm every day. Noah and his family started to observe how the waves affected the large ship's sides differently. As though the waters themselves were tired from their long toil, the powerful, unending thrust of judgment had given way to a softer ebb. The world was changing, and the animals in the ark were moving more peacefully, as their senses picked up on what the human eye could not yet see. Noah believed he caught a glimpse of something other than water one morning through a thinning mist. The faint outline of a peak, like a shadow rising from the depths, brushed the surface. Day after day, he kept a close eye on things until they were undeniable. Mountains that had once been engulfed by the flood were raising their heads to the sky as the waters receded. A reminder of everything that had been lost, and a promise of everything that might start over. The sight was both beautiful and eerie. The ark floated aimlessly on invisible currents, but Noah sensed that it was being led. He recalled the promise of survival, the flood warning, the instruction to build, and the voice of God. They would undoubtedly find rest in the same hand that brought the water. So they waited in peace in their wooden haven, seeing the peaks get closer, sharper, and clearer every day. The ark finally came to a stop after several weeks of drifting. As if it had been carefully placed, it settled with a deep, soft stillness rather than a startling crash. The enormous ship had landed on Mount Ararat's slopes. For the first time since the waters had raised it so high above the ground, the ark was no longer adrift as its timbers creaked gently as it adjusted to the mountain's embrace. Noah's heart was filled with silent thanks as his hands pressed against the walls and he felt the silence. They had been taken to a location that God had selected. They were not lost on the sea. Like a sentinel of the new world, the mountain rose above the retreating flood. Dry stone and earth were starting to show through its slopes, but the waters still covered plains and valleys far around its base. The snow on its summits glinted in the wan sunlight, serving as a reminder that the world was still alive despite its scars. As though keeping watch over the earth's gradual awakening, the ark lay there, cradled by rock and sky. The days went on inside in their steady rhythm. After caring for the animals for several months, Noah and his family practiced their movements. The animals awoke with a restlessness of their own, knowing that the world would soon summon them once more. The sheep pressed against the wooden walls as though they were pining for grass underfoot. The lions walked silently, and the birds flitted in their cages. The very act of creation appeared to favor renewal. The waters were lowered gradually rather than quickly, as if the world needed time to recover. Rivers formed where floods receded, the outlines of forests appeared beneath the retreating tide, and valleys that had been submerged for months gradually showed their contours. Rivers carved their paths, lakes settled into hollows, and seas returned to their ancient beds as the once violent waters now flowed gently back to where they belonged. Noah watched patiently as the earth changed, understanding that each phase was a component of the grand renewal. When the ark was motionless on the mountain at night, Noah would emerge under the stars, which were now more visible than they had been during the storm. The only sounds to break the vast silence were the sighing of the wind over the water or the distant call of a bird. The air was clear. Recalling the voice that had summoned him to this task, he would raise his eyes to the sky and mumble his gratitude. Despite the weight of judgment, God's hand was stirring the world again, and mercy was greater. The return of the land was a source of both relief and sadness. Relief because it signaled the approach of freedom, the possibility of touching soil, planting trees, and rebuilding homes. Anguish for each bare hill and valley also served as a reminder of the people who had been carried away, of cities that would never be rebuilt, and of voices that had been muffled by the flood. But there was peace even in this silent mourning. Noah's family served as the guardians of the new world that was emerging after the old one had passed. Weeks passed while the ark stood motionless on Ararat, a monument to both judgment and salvation. Noah and his family watched as fields of mud turned to solid ground and patches of green emerged as the waters further receded. Every glimpse of the earth was like a softly whispered promise. The door would open soon, and they would enter a waiting and sanitized world. Beneath them, the mountain remained solid, a pillar in a clean world, and the narrative of the flood changed from one of devastation to one of rebirth as the ark lay there, motionless and silent. Once ferocious and devouring, the waters now receded gently, revealing a land that had been concealed but not forgotten. The ark on Ararat came to represent surviving the storm, holding on to hope, and keeping life safe. Day by day, the waters receded, removing the final remnants of a corrupted world and exposing a blank canvas that would soon be the subject of a fresh start. And inside the ark, hearts waited in silence, full of faith, patience, and wonder, knowing that the door would soon open and that the sound of footsteps on the ground would once again break the stillness of the mountains. After being at sea for so long, the ark finally settled down. Its timbers made a soft, creaking sound as if they were letting out a sigh of relief after transporting so much life across the seas. The sounds of breathing, the rustle of feathers, the shifting of hooves and paws, and the warmth of living things filled the air inside. Together, Noah and his family stood, their faces worn but composed, their hearts full of thankfulness that the protracted ordeal was over. Outside, the world had transformed from a restless ocean to a peaceful land that awaited fresh footsteps on its soil. Like the opening of a door after a long night, the order to depart felt both light and heavy. Light poured in like its own flood as the ark's door was opened. The air felt fresh because of a gentle radiance that touched every nook and cranny instead of the glare of devastation. With caution, the family walked, their sandals digging into the new ground. The first signs of a new world were the marks their footsteps made in the softer ground. Every breath they took seemed to be a promise, a reminder that life had been spared so that they could not only survive, but also start over. The vastness of the silence outside enveloped them like a blanket, the stillness of the lack of sound and voices almost sacred. The animals behind them stirred with restless vitality. Eager for freedom, some pushed toward the opening, their senses searching for earthly sounds and scents. As though the entire release process were a part of a sacred rhythm, Noah patiently led them, letting each pair go outside. Abruptly, the birds rose from the ark, their cries piercing the air like fragile bells. They were free to map the vast sky as they circled overhead. Each one reclaimed a place in the balance of creation as the field's beasts moved steadily out, claws clutching the ground and hooves touching the soil. Despite being cleaned by the waters, the ground wasn't bare. Green shoots had started to emerge, fragile but resilient, as though the ground had been waiting for a moment to be renewed. The trees that were left stood with silent fortitude, their branches reaching skyward, hungry for light. Tiny, pale flowers, their hues like whispers against the ground, were scattered along the landscape's edges, as if it had also borne the burden of the flood and was now waking from a protracted slumber. Nature itself appeared to exhale in relief. The animals stopped and sniffed the air, following their instincts into this land that had been reborn. Every step forward held memories for Noah and his family. They recalled the times when there had been a lot of noise on the ground, when laughter had become derisive, and when pride had been in the hearts of both giants and men. Now, on the other hand, the silence conveyed humility rather than pride. They were few but chosen, and the fact that they survived the storm was a testament to grace rather than their own fortitude. They were reminded of the task at hand by the gentle weight of that grace as they stood on the open ground. Though vast and empty, the world didn't seem hopeless. It resembled a canvas that had been cleaned by water and was ready to be painted with fresh hues. The family was aware that the initial strokes of this picture would be written by their lives. This new beginning would be shaped by every seed sown, every house constructed, and every prayer uttered into the atmosphere. Even though the land was quiet, it was listening and prepared to carry the sounds of life again. Noah's heart grew as he saw his sons emerge into the daylight, their spirits full of hope and their eyes wide with awe. His wife gazed gently at the land, as if it were a present that had just been opened. The daughters-in-law whispered words of gratitude and amazement while holding hands and speaking quietly but steadily. With the ark behind them, the future in front of them, and the sky above them like a watchful eye, the family stood together in the open air. The animals dispersed, each moving in unison while adhering to its own nature. The rumble of beasts, the soft scurry of smaller animals, and the calls of birds were among the sounds that filled the air after being muffled inside the ark. Each animal's step added to the melody, which seemed to be the earth recalling its song piece by piece. Life spread across the land as streams, nourished by the receding waters, shimmered in the sunlight. The rivers pulsed with fresh energy as they flowed through the earth's body like veins. Noah looked up at the sky, where light was spreading in soft gold and clouds were parting. Heaven itself seemed to be observing and subtly blessing this tender moment. Now, there was only the serene presence of peace instead of thunder or the roar of the waves. He inhaled deeply, feeling the connection between heaven and earth reaffirming with each breath. Even though he was still behind it, the ark no longer appeared to be a prison of survival, but rather a ship that had safely brought life into the future. Its silence now reverberated with appreciation that its timbers had fulfilled their purpose. With steady hands and reverently shaking hearts, the family collected stones and constructed a basic altar. They set it on fire, and the smoke curled upward as if it were conveying their gratitude to worlds beyond the visible. The smells of fresh soil and new grass blended with the aroma of sacrifice as it floated through the atmosphere. There was a bridge between what had been destroyed and what was being reborn in that rising smoke, a recognition of the past and hope for the future. Life unfolded slowly around them. Animals found resting spots, birds built nests in branches, and streams whispered songs across valleys. The air itself appeared to be glowing with rebirth, as if each particle had been cleansed and prepared for a fresh tale. At the beginning of that story, Noah and his family stood quietly and modestly, their faith serving as the foundation for everything that lay ahead, and their lives synchronized with the rhythm of the land. Instead of being eerie, the silence that spanned the horizon was now full of promise, waiting to be broken by the first harvest, the first laughter, or the first new steps of generations that had not yet been born. After the lengthy trial of waters, the air was calm and heavy at the same time. Pale and dense, the clouds moved slowly across the sky as if they were reluctant to move after emptying themselves for so many days and nights. With their eyes fixed on the sky and their hearts still shaking from the memory of what they had gone through, Noah and his family stood on the freshly cleaned ground. The quiet was profound, but it was not void. Rather, it was anticipating something. Then light came softly through the clouds, as if heaven itself wished to calm the earth. A quiet and magnificent bow of colors stretched out in the space between storm and peace as the sun's gentle beams spread across the sky. It wasn't the thunderous roar or the piercing light of lightning. A bridge of light arching across the heavens, the rainbow seemed to be a whisper. Its hues blended together in a gentle harmony, with red turning into orange, orange into gold, gold into green, fading into blue, and finally violet. It glistened like a dream brought to life, delicate yet unbreakable, as if painted by invisible hands. As Noah gazed at it, his breath caught in his chest. His children stood in silence, the glow touching their faces and widening their eyes, as if they too sensed the significance contained in that arc of light. Even the animals stopped, their instincts temporarily quieted. The calm but authoritative voice that had led Noah through storms and warnings now spoke once more. Beyond just being beautiful, the rainbow that stretched across the landscape was a sign, a covenant made between heaven and earth. The voice said that the world would never be submerged underwater again. Floods would never again sweep away all living things. As a reminder to each generation that devastation would not be the last word, the rainbow served as the seal of that promise. Time and space were bound together by color, as if heaven itself had stooped to leave a mark of peace on the planet. With relief in their hearts, the family listened with reverence. They had witnessed the weight of judgment and the might of merciless rising waters during the flood. Now, however, they stood beneath a sky that was filled with mercy rather than wrath, and the rainbow appeared to soothe their souls like a soft salve. A gentle gesture after such immense grief, its curve extended as if embracing the world itself. Words of gratitude trembled from Noah's lips as he bowed his head and whispered them into the quiet. Hands clasped, faces raised, his wife, sons, and their wives huddled together. Even though they were few, they felt encircled by a prom, as that was greater than the land, the sky, and themselves. The hues persisted in the atmosphere, appearing to have taken root in the heavens rather than vanishing like ephemeral light. They were reminded of the power of fire and its radiance of life by the red's shimmering warmth. The gold spoke of promised harvests that were waiting beneath the soil but had not yet been sown. The green sang of ungrown fields and valleys that would soon be teeming with life once more. No longer rushing with rage, the blue was deep and serene, like waters at peace. And the violet, a shade that seemed to whisper of mysteries close but hidden, was serene and regal. The colors blended to create a visual song that touched the heart. The ark, a worn and silent reminder of survival etched into wood, still lay on the slopes of Ararat. But now that the rainbow was overhead, it appeared as though a chapter was coming to an end, a vessel that had seen them through judgment and now stood as a testament to faith realized. The family realized that life was progressing as they gazed at it and then at the sky. For them, their children, and their children's children, the rainbow was a sign. The bow would reappear whenever clouds gathered and rain started to fall, serving as a gentle reminder that the earth could never be completely destroyed by storms again. The hum of life returning filled the air as animals walked slowly across the land, their voices filling the air with their unhurried steps. The distant roar of beasts, the cries of birds, and the lowing of cattle all blended into a song that blended with the peaceful presence of the rainbow. The trees swayed with light caught in their leaves, the streams glittered with reflected colors, and the earth itself seemed to hum in agreement. There was even a hint of sweetness in the breeze, as if the rainbow's colors had been brushed on it. The weight of responsibility weighed heavily on Noah's heart as he raised at his eyes once more. A new world had begun, one that was based on God's covenant rather than human chaos. The rainbow served as a call to live morally in the present, while also serving as a reminder of what would never be again. The generations that followed would be shaped by every decision he made, every seed he sowed, and every word he spoke to his children. The promise above them provided a boundary, a gentle edge of hope that encircled the flood memory, but it did not erase it. As they marveled at the colors, the children's voices rose softly. Their faces were full of the simple wonder that only pure eyes can contain as they pointed and whispered to each other. Their laughter rose into the air like the music of a rainbow, and they carried the freshness of hope instead of the burden of memory that their father carried. As Noah listened, his heart became lighter because he realized that the covenant was for them as well as for him and the life that would result from them. The rainbow persisted, spanning land and ocean, serving as a link between the past grief and the future. As if heaven itself were embracing the world with color, its curve appeared to cradle and hold the earth close. There was only the assurance that peace would always return after rain, and there was no fear or storm shadow in its serene brilliance. And Noah felt as if the world had let out a breath, the long tension released, the silence now filled with the soft hum of grace as he stood beneath it, the gentle ark glowing softly above his head. After the flood, there was a sense of freshness in the air, a calm that seemed to rest on the mountains and seep into the ground. With cautious steps, Noah traversed the land, his gaze settling on valleys that had once been submerged under water, but were now reviving with green shoots and the rumblings of life. Both the weight of promise and the memory of Sheol, if judgment weighed heavily on his heart. His sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were moving with their families around him, caring for animals, sowing seeds, and making the initial impressions of what would turn out to be a new tale for humanity. The earth's silence seemed to remind them that their lives carried the weight of generations yet to be born, even though they may not have fully understood the enormity of it. They were the roots from which nations would grow. Shem had a calm dignity about him, and he spoke sparingly but steadily. He followed in his father's footsteps, retaining Noah's respect for the Creator. His gaze appeared to linger on the sky for a longer period of time than others, as if he was looking for the secrets that lay beyond the rainbows, as well as the promise of them. He would be the source of a lineage that would eventually lead to Abraham, prophets, and the fulfillment of promises, carrying with it the whispers of covenant. The seed of a people whose stories, songs, and faith would bear the memory of the flood, and the hope of redemption was in Shem's tender hands. Ham was different. He had a restless spirit. He walked quickly, his gaze frequently darting to the horizon as if the land itself could not quell his interest. Ham looked out, while Shem looked up. He was bold and strong, but he also had the dark side of impatience. Conflict would inevitably arise along his path, and his decisions would have long-lasting effects that he was still unable to comprehend. Nations that deviated greatly from the covenant, but nevertheless contributed to the history of the world, would descend from his line. Ham's legacy would be broad and heavy, with his descendants spreading into regions where cities grew with power and deserts stretched, even though the flood had washed away the corruption of the past. Japheth walked with a softness that was open and strong at the same time. His hands were itching, to build, to shape, to explore, while his heart leaned toward the vastness of the world. His line would extend far into the islands and coasts, filling lands with voices, cultures, and tongues, as if the vastness of the earth were calling to him. As if his name, Japheth, which means enlargement, were a blessing draped over his shoulders. His children would rise with ships on the seas, their voyages blazing paths across continents, their legacy spreading widely. He stood firmly by his father, but he frequently looked out to the horizon, as if he could already see the nations his descendants would grow into. With the heart of a father who understood that his time was both over and coming to an end, Noah watched them. His hands, weary from tending the earth and building the ark, lay now on the ground of a fresh start. His sons carried life into the future after he carried it through judgment. They all possessed qualities that would endure over time. Japheth's openness and breadth, Ham's restless boldness, and Shem's reverence. They resembled a tree's branches that extended in various directions, but they all belonged to the same root, the same covenant denoted by the sky's bow of colors. The families fell into rhythms that were familiar and odd at the same time. Animals moved silently among them, children's voices rose with laughter, and fires were lit at dusk. The promise of growth replaced the fear of rising waters in the air. With her eyes observing her sons and grandchildren with a silent pride, Noah's wife sat by the fireplace, her face etched with age and endurance. After enduring the storm with her husband, she now sat in the ensuing calm as the matriarch of all future generations. The flood was always in the back of mind. The family's hearts would clench in silence whenever the sky became overcast, until the rainbow reappeared as a reminder that the covenant was still in place. Shem would frequently whisper to his kids the tale of the ark, the giants who once roamed the earth, and the waters that engulfed everything. The children developed a respect for the God who had saved their family because of his quiet but truthful voice. In contrast, Ham would narrate stories with a keener edge, speaking more quickly and making wide gestures with his hands as he talked about bravery and storms, mountains and survival. Japheth's tales were kinder, frequently intertwined with visions of distant places, uncharted seas, and valleys that had not yet been inhabited. The families started to disperse, cautiously at first, as if to test the earth's resilience after it had been submerged. Homes were shaped, fields were planted, and stone altars were raised in appreciation. However, the same freedom that existed prior to the flood was still present in people's hearts. Noah understood that even though the earth had been cleansed by judgment, the conflict between faith and foolishness still existed. With his hope rooted in the covenant established in the heavens, he prayed for his sons while keeping an eye on them and raising his voice in whispers beneath the stars. The sons developed into their own patriarchs over the years. Their camps grew, their children grew, and the voices of new generations filled the air. Japheth's line expanded into coasts and far-off horizons. Ham's expanded into areas of power and strife, and Shem's line carried the reverence of covenant. Noah lived to witness the First Nations emerging from his sons' tents as the world was gradually being repopulated, voice by voice. The knowledge that life had not only survived, but had also started over, warmed his heart as he sat in the evenings with the firelight flickering on his face and the sound of children's laughter blending with the crackling flames. A gentle and steady symbol of the covenant, the rainbow persisted in arching across the sky after storms. Noah's sons would raise their eyes at every appearance, recalling the promise as well as the judgment. They were aware that they were living for the many generations that would come after them as well as for themselves. Over time, their names would reverberate, being incorporated into kingdoms and tribes, into histories and lineages, into tales narrated under the stars and inscribed on stone. More than just men, they were the beginnings, the silent foundations of humanity's resurrection following the flood's silence. As a result, Shem, Ham, and Japheth continued their father's legacy, their decisions influencing the earth's vast fabric. The mountains stood as silent witnesses to the expansion of humanity, the seas mirrored the travels of their descendants, and the valleys echoed with the voices of their children. Because his sons carried the world itself within them, Noah watched, prayed, and hoped, his heart resting not only in the past but also in the future. The earth had inhaled deeply, the ark had rested, and the waters had long since subsided. However, not everything was lost in the flood. Something remained of the giants, even though their towering bodies had fallen, their strength broken by the waves that covered the world. Though they were bound to the world they once tormented, their spirits rose unmoored from their death, stripped of flesh. These restless beings' souls, in contrast to those of regular men, found neither light nor rest in the afterlife. Their fate was unique since they were born of an odd union, a blending of the daughters of earth and the watchers of heaven. They wandered aimlessly, their violence and hunger twisted into invisible shapes. People from the generations following the flood described strange heaviness that descended on houses at night. shapes they saw out of the corner of their eyes, and whispers in the dark. The elders told their children that these were the giants' shadows tethered to the ground, incapable of ascending back to the sky, and unsuited to sleep beneath the ground. Once thundering with strength and might, their cries had devolved into hollow murmurs that sounded like wind through broken stones. Their spirits carried the memory of their destruction, wandering across deserts, hiding in forests, and following those who walked in the valleys, even though the world had been purified of their bodies. They were restless because they were always hungry. Fields, flocks, and even men themselves had been devoured by their appetites in life. That desire only changed in death, shifting to the weakness of hearts and minds rather than to bread or flesh. Wherever possible, they tried to cause trouble, to whisper, to incite violence. Never still, never content, they slipped into the corners of the world like formless shadows. It was said that their unseen hands fanned the flames of despair when anger burned or fear shivered, and that they rejoiced in the destruction of men just as they had once rejoiced in the destruction of the earth. However, their power had diminished. They were now confined to drifting, their strength broken, rather than giants looming over the land. They were unable to create or rule as kings among men, but they were able to agitate, perplex, and encroach on the boundaries of human existence. Shepherds related tales of flocks being dispersed by invisible monsters and unexpected storms rising. Mothers whispered about children being startled awake by frightening dreams that were too dark for their impressionable brains. Even though the skies were calm, travelers described chilly winds that seemed to be carrying sighs of anger and grief as they swept through the wilderness. As a result, the giant spirits were regarded as the invisible ones throughout history. Not men, not angels, not the dead, but something in between, shadows that wandered aimlessly. They were creatures that lived in deserted areas, haunting ruins and arid regions. Some referred to them as demons, while others called them jinn. Later, temples would emerge, offering sacrifices to strange gods that might have been nothing more than these spirits disguised in human fears. Because the giants had once loved dominion, they were restless and still wanted to be worshipped in order to relive their sense of awe. Their presence seemed closer on calm nights, when the moon was low and the earth was silent. Although no one walked next to them, travelers claimed to have heard footsteps in the sand. Although no animals stirred, hunters reported feeling eyes on their backs deep in the forest. To keep them at bay, villages built fires, their flames a flimsy barrier against shapeless shadows. The world was never completely free of the giants' echo, even though humanity multiplied once more. Their flesh had been destroyed by the flood, but not their reach. Some people thought that because the spirits had fought with each other in life, they now fought even among themselves. Their wandering was characterized by discontent and jealousy, and their hunger was directed both inward and outward. As though invisible hands had fanned the flames of violence, their presence was occasionally felt during wars when men turned against one another with unrelenting rage. At other times, they appeared to lurk in barren places, consuming loneliness and fear. Even so, despite the centuries-long journey to that day, they were unable to avoid the judgment that ultimately awaited them. These spirits would persist until the great day of final judgment, according to Enoch's long-ago words. His words were laden with truth, and Noah's descendants recalled. They assured their kids that although the world was safe, there were still dangers. They claimed that the giants' violence had caused the earth to scream, and that their spirits were now wandering around it as echoes of that same corruption. The ground had been cleansed by the flood, but the stain of their unnatural birth remained. However, they were subject to restrictions even while they were wandering. They were able to stir and whisper, but they were unable to break the rainbow-sealed covenant. Even though they were in shadow, there was still hope for light in the skies. By praying and speaking to the Creator who had restrained them, men learned to fight against them. They were still there, but they lacked the strength of the hand that had previously shattered the deep fountains. The memory of the giants served as the foundation for tales of hauntings, invisible battles, and spirits pressing on human hearts throughout the ages. Their bodies were dust, but they were still there. They stayed awake until the very end, serving as a reminder and a warning that corruption leaves behind traces that are difficult to erase. Their towering presence had been removed from the world by the flood, but their invisible shadows continued to move through time's corners in silence, waiting for the day when even they would be permanently silenced. In addition to being an ancient event, the tale of the Great Flood reverberates through time like a gentle echo, imparting lessons that are just as pertinent today as they were when the ark first landed on the mountain. It describes a world that was cleansed, a world that had descended into corruption and was restored by patience, water, and one family's unwavering obedience. A call to introspection, a reminder that human actions matter, that decisions have an impact on the world, and that faith can be a lantern that keeps the spirit steady in the storm even when the skies grow gloomy and the rain seems to never stop, are all contained in the story's gentle rhythm. The earth and its inhabitants were reshaped by the flood, which was both a punishment and a second chance, a harmony of justice and mercy. Since the floodwaters were a reaction to a creation that had lost its purpose, it is impossible to avoid feeling the weight of justice within them. The ancient harmony had been disrupted, greed had taken over hearts, and violence had swept the planet. The world was reminded by the flood's power and silence that divine justice cannot be disregarded indefinitely. However, justice was not meted out mindlessly because, despite the devastation, one family was raised and saved by grace. A single life of obedience can open the door to mercy for future generations, as demonstrated by Noah's quiet and unwavering faith, which served as a bridge between judgment and renewal. As delicate as the rainbow that subsequently arched across the sky, mercy is also interwoven throughout the narrative. Mercy existed in the ark itself, even though the waters carried away the old world. Mercy was what allowed animals to be preserved, gave humanity a second chance, and sowed the seeds of a fresh start on the sleeping mountain. The flood would have been the end if there had been no mercy. Rather, it turned into a pause, a purification, and then a gentle restart. In this way, the story reassures us that mercy has the ability to write the next chapter and bring light after darkness, even when life seems to be overtaken by judgment or loss. The core of Noah's story was faith. It took a faith that went beyond what the human eye could see to construct an ark on dry land in the face of doubt and incredulity. Every hammer blow, every meticulous collection of animals, and every piece of wood all contained faith. As the rain drummed against the sides of the ark, Noah carried hope inside through faith. Though it stabilized the hands that persevered through the storm, faith did not make the storm go away. It teaches us that having faith is not a guarantee that life will be without difficulties. Rather, faith is the fortitude to face them head-on, to have faith in something bigger than fear, and to move forward even when the road is cloudy. Throughout the story, obedience subtly appears. Line by line, detail by detail, Noah followed the instructions without question or argument. The length of the ark, the gathering of provisions, and the sealing of the door may have all seemed insignificant at the time, but taken as a whole, they created the vessel that carried life itself across the seas. This teaches that obedience is frequently quiet, steady, and modest rather than grand or dramatic. However, it has the capacity to transform, preserve, and protect within its steady rhythm. The flood also portends a new beginning for the human spirit as well as the planet. It seemed as though the world had been given a deep breath and a fresh start when the waters subsided. The skies would clear, rivers would flow with new life, and the fields would sprout new grass. Every weary soul can learn from this renewal that renewal is possible, even when life seems to be overtaken by storms or drowned in mistakes. If we let go of the floodwaters of the past, the same hand that led the ark can lead us to our own new beginnings. The flood story also imparts humility to those who pay close attention. The vast waters served as a reminder to, O humanity, of our frailty and our insignificance in comparison to the forces of creation. Once unshakable mountains disappeared under the waves. Once proud cities fell silent. It serves as a subdued reminder that human strength is finite and that wealth and power cannot defeat eternity. However, humility also contains wisdom because it allows one to see that life is supported by grace that flows unseen rather than by one's own efforts. The lessons go even deeper into legacy and community. The lesson of the flood is that decisions made by one generation have an impact on subsequent generations. The earth was reshaped by the consequences of the old world's corruption, but Noah's faith laid the groundwork for all families to come. Every action, whether it be one of defiance or faith, of violence or kindness, has an impact on lives that may never know our names. This is a gentle reminder to live mindfully and to consider every decision as a seed that could grow into something much bigger than ourselves. A lesson in patience can also be found in the story's quiet. We are reminded that renewal does not happen immediately by the 40 days and nights of rain, the long months spent adrift on the water, and the waiting for the dove to return with a branch. Life changes gradually, much like the flood did. It takes patience to wait and to believe that work is being done behind the still waters. Despite its challenges, patience enables the soul to rest even in the absence of immediate answers and to hold fast until the dry ground eventually emerges. Hope is arguably the flood's most poignant lesson. The rainbow, which is softly stretched across the sky, represents the heart as well as the earth. It serves as a reminder that beauty can emerge after a storm. It reassures us that despite the world's seeming brokenness, there is still something valuable to preserve and something worth starting over. Hope got Noah and his family through the storm, and it still gets us through our own today. Hope conveys the message that life is still waiting on the other side of the ocean, much like the dove with its olive branch. In this sense, the flood story is a mirror held up to our own lives rather than a remote historical event. It talks about mercy and justice, faith and obedience, humility and patience, hope and renewal. These lessons, which have been subtly woven through the ages, have an impact on people of all ages and provide direction to those who hear them. The story itself carries wisdom across time, resting peacefully in the hearts of those who are willing to listen, just as the ark once carried life across the deep. In addition to being told in words, the story of the flood and the giant's judgment is also told in silence, in the stillness of the waters that once covered the earth, and in the quiet footsteps of those who survived. It floats through the halls of memory like a protracted dream. It starts with a world out of balance, where corruption and violence were rampant, and where the giants of legend, the children of heaven and earth, brought destruction with their restless power. It progresses slowly through the warning given to Noah, the ark's construction, the 2x2 gathering of life, and the long nights during which the rain never stopped. Like a lantern shining in the dark, the sound of faith permeates everything, steady and serene. The flood was more than just devastation. It was a judgment and a purification. And in that washing away came both grief and rebirth, an end and a beginning. Once, the giants, who were the offspring of a forbidden union, walked the land as though it were their own. Although they were unrivaled in strength, their hunger was limitless, consuming all the goodness in the world until even human cries reached heaven. Their bodies died when the waters arrived, but their souls remained. Wandering around restlessly, they shaped the shadows of conflict and whispers of temptation throughout history. Although the flood brought justice to their flesh, Their legacy served as a reminder to all generations that rebellion has repercussions and that decisions made in one generation can have far-reaching effects. Even so, this chilling reality serves as a gentle reminder that hearts can be safely led through such shadows by faith, obedience, and divine mercy. Like a gentle and steady lullaby, Noah's story weaves through this enormous tapestry. The hope of all creation was saved by the obedience of one man as well as his family. His trust got him through the storm, but his hands created a vessel of survival. Children were sleeping, animals were breathing softly, and prayers were being whispered against the thunderous rain inside the wooden walls of the ark. A new chapter of life began on earth when the waters eventually started to recede, the mountaintops reappeared, and the dove brought its olive branch back. Rivers flowed, grass grew again, and skies softened again. The Rainbow Covenant, which is as gentle and transient as a dream, but as resilient as the sky itself, continues to stretch across the heavens as a reminder of promise. It speaks of life after loss, of mercy after judgment, and of color after gray storms. Every arc of light is like a whisper, stating that there is hope woven into the very fabric of the clouds and that the earth will never again be submerged in such waters. Fragile but precious, humanity was given a second chance, a fresh start on dry land. The rainbow shines to remind us that mercy has not left, even though the world would still struggle with its imperfections. The judgment of the giants and the flood are not just folk tales. They are silent lessons that still resonate with us today. They impart lessons on the price of corruption, the significance of decisions, and the resilience of faith in the face of adversity. They serve as a reminder of humility, because even the greatest giants were unable to resist the tide, and patience because the ark floated for a long time before land appeared. They encourage us to cling to hope even in the face of gloom and to pay attention to the quiet, tiny voice that demands obedience. These teachings, which have been passed down through the ages, rest now like soft waves on the heart, requesting only to be recalled with thankfulness rather than fear. So, as this lengthy journey comes to a close, allow the story to gently settle in your mind, like the sound of waves lapping against a calm beach. As you drift into sleep, may it remind you that dawn always comes, storms pass, and waters recede. May you take with you the serenity of the rainbow across the sky, the peace of the ark on the seas, and the silent comfort of knowing that hope and mercy are always nearby. Rest well, listener, and may you sleep soundly through the night, enshrouded in the silence of this age-old tale.